Good morning. Welcome to the November 15th Green Ribbon Science Panel meeting. Kari?
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of DTSC's Green Ribbon Science Panel meeting. My name is Kari Rasmussen, and I work for DTSC's Public Participation Program. On behalf of the department, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to be here today. Let me take this moment to announce that in addition to those of us here in the room today, the public is also following along via webcast. If you are tuning in to the discussion via webcast and you would like to provide input, please email your questions and comments to saferconsumerproducts@dtsc.ca.gov. Today's meeting is also being recorded, and transcripts will be posted to DTSC's public website once they are made available to the department. Finally, I want to announce that all attendees at today's Green Ribbon Science Panel meeting are subject to the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act to preserve public transparency of the public's discussion and decisions. Now, I'd like to turn the meeting over to the co-chairs.
Kari, thank you very much. Before Kelly and I do our opening remarks and go through the review of the agenda, I'm going to ask Dr. Williams to speak to us this morning because she actually has other meetings that she needs to attend to. Dr. Williams?
Thank you, Art. I'm very bummed that I can't attend the rest of the meeting this morning, so I wanted at least to get an opportunity to thank everyone. Normally the thanks are given at the end of the meeting, but I'm going to give mine right now, starting with staff for all the preparation, all the thoughtfulness. There was a change in guidance for this meeting, and Kelly really stepped up and led the whole team to putting together the background documents and doing the preparation. Andre's thought piece about the retrospective look at the prioritization process, I just thought it was tremendous. So, Andre, my hat's off to you. The presentations were sound. From the snacks to the technology, everything went smoothly as we've come to expect. So thank you, everybody, for being such a shining example of DTSC. Really great work. And to our panelists, I heard this morning already how valuable the input yesterday was, and I expect the same of today. Sometimes you don't know. I know that's always a challenge of, did we give them what they need? And the answer is most assuredly yes, already, and you haven't even done your second day's work. So we are extremely grateful, and as I said, it was a smaller group this time, but I think it really gave between the short presentations and the smaller group, I think it really gave you all a chance to dig in and really wrestle with some issues, and we found that very, very helpful. So again, thank you to everyone, to our co-chairs for carving out the time to give us the feedback, to shape the meeting, and to continue to guide the panel's work. So thank you, and peace out.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. Kelly, do you have any comments before we go to the agenda?
I just want to welcome everyone this morning and point out that you have 2 mics, and today's mics are different. The ones that look big and fancy are for the court reporter, and there's no need to touch those at all. So he's doing that to create the transcript, and you don't need to turn them on and off or do anything else. The small ones on the table, the trick on them is to recognize they're not a button. It's a touch thing, so you just barely touch it and lift your finger off, and that's all you need to do. So the harder you press, the longer you press, the more likely it will go wrong. So, and the batteries die on them, so that's why the staff have been running all around, changing them out and so forth. So if you see anything other than the flashing green light or the flashing red light, and stick up your hand, and the staff have been incredible in handling those logistics for us. So thank you, and looking forward to the morning.
Great, thank you very much. Today, we'll begin with a public comment period, after which we will spend our time discussing the implementation of an alternatives analysis threshold. Dr. Ann Cooper-Doherty will kick off that discussion, outlining potential options for setting and AT. We'll follow the presentation with significant time for a panel discussion on the AAT. After that, we will have a quick brainstorming session on factors that DTSC should consider in designing the green chemistry research and development regulatory response. And if time allows, I'd like to do something that we did last time. It's towards the end of the meeting, allow staff members to ask if the things that we did not cover that you guys would like us to, touch on. So let's start off with a presentation on the AAT. Anne?
No, I think we can.
Oh, I'm sorry, it's public comment. We're all so excited about.
All right. Before today's panel discussion, we will once again be taking public comments. If the webinar participants would wish to comment today, please email your comments to saferconsumerproducts@dtsc.ca.gov, and it will be read aloud. Comments submitted remotely will be read to the panel after we hear from the commenters in the room. The public is reminded that today's comments are directed to the Green Ribbon Science Panel and on the agenda topics. That is, the materials that were presented to the panel. Public comments directed to DTSC are not appropriate at this meeting. Please note that the panel is not able to respond to comments or answer any questions as this is a working meeting. If you have not signed up to comment, you may do so at this time. Staff have comment cards for you to indicate that you'd wish to comment. Based on the number of commenters, we may need to limit the amount of time. Are there any commenters in the room? No? Any commenters from email? Okay. Seeing that there are not any commenters, we'll begin with the panel discussion. Turning it back over to you, the co-chairs.
Kari, thank you very much. Now we'll hear from Ann Cooper, Senior Environmental Scientist, about setting an alternatives analysis threshold. Ann Cooper?
All right. Thank you, Art. It looks like I've got 20 extra minutes. So I kind of wanted to set the stage for the alternatives analysis threshold, or AAT as we're going to call it, discussion that we're going to have this morning. And I know I heard Helen saying, yay, chemistry. And there's definitely going to be some chemistry talks about this, but we also wanted to kind of keep it on a more conceptual level, because while there is definitely the ability to get really in the weeds with this, we wanted to make sure that we kind of consider it at a higher conceptual level as well. So to kind of dig into the conversation, I wanted to start with giving you some basics about 1,4-dioxane. You heard a little bit about it yesterday. Some of you may know about it otherwise. And this is the chemical that we've been researching that's kind of kicked off all of this discussion about AAT. So it's a small, highly soluble, persistent chemical in water. It's volatile. We know that it's a likely carcinogen per the US EPA, and the National Toxicology Program indicates that this is via any route of exposure. We know that it doesn't stick to solids like filters, like a Brita filter, or particulates in a wastewater treatment plant. And then as a result, it's not removed by most standard water treatment methods. So as Kelly alluded to yesterday, the persistent, mobile, toxic kind of trio. So DTSC's concerns include impacts to the water supply, as Kelly highlighted yesterday, as well as the potential for aggregate human exposure, as Carl highlighted in the maps and stuff that we've created, particularly for environmental justice communities. So one of the really interesting things about 1,4-dioxane is that it's a contaminant formed in the production of ethoxylated surfactants and other raw materials that might be ethoxylated. So as a result, the two work plan categories that we're focusing on the most are cleaning products such as laundry detergents and dish detergents, and beauty, personal care, and hygiene products such as shampoo, body wash, and cosmetics, because these are the types of products most likely to use these type of surfactants. So an alternatives analysis threshold is something that is required for contaminants, which is why it's kind of come to the forefront with our work on 1,4-dioxane. And the implications are that manufacturers of products with 1,4-dioxane concentrations below this AAT level that we would set are not required to conduct an alternatives analysis and instead would submit an AAT notification. And of course, with that is DTSC's then duty to review the notifications and be able to interpret them and determine if companies are below this AAT as they say they are. And as we discussed in depth at the last meeting, it is not a risk-based threshold. And to that end, the regulations define the AAT as the practical quantitation limit by default. And this PQL gets a little tricky, but the EPA defines it as 5 to 10 times the method detection limit, which in and of itself can be a little tricky. But the final statement of reasons indicates that it would not be prudent for DTSC to establish a threshold above the PQL, absent information demonstrating that a higher level is appropriate. And the AAT is set at the product level, not the ingredient level. I know that conversation came up a little bit last time, but the AAT is set on the final product, the priority product that we are listing, but we do have some kind of thoughts on that later. So just kind of a timeline of the efforts of the work that we've been doing with 1,4-dioxane since we last saw you. So in April, we had it as a topic. And then in May, we released our background document that highlighted the concerns that we had around 1,4-dioxane, and we announced 2 workshops. In June, we had the first of those workshops, which was in Southern California, focused on adverse impacts because that's where a lot of the recycled water generators are that are having a lot of issues with 1,4-dioxane. And then in August, we released a discussion AAT proposal, and we hosted a workshop here in Sacramento on the AAT and the presence in products. We got a lot of really great feedback from that kind of May to August timeframe. And so now we're back here to you to get you to help us grapple with the questions that we've been grappling with over the last few months. So this is very timely and helpful for us. So the AAT discussion proposal, the intent was to provide a concrete number to spur discussion and to kind of give a dry run, if you will, of proposing an AAT. So it's not an actual proposal. We haven't even determined a priority product or anything along that lines. It was more of, let's get something out there just that people can discuss, because the thought was the more concrete we can be, the better the feedback will be that we'll receive from stakeholders. So we proposed 1 ppm in personal care and cleaning products, and I'll give some perspective on that in a minute. But in putting together our proposal, we really tried to listen to the feedback from the grass from last time, where you indicated that it would be really helpful to really be very clear in what you're proposing, why you're proposing it, things along that nature. So we considered things like product testing data, known lab procedures, other regulations, and the impact of different concentrations of 1,4-dioxane in products on the California water supply. So this is a plot of 1,4-dioxane concentrations in personal care and cleaning products based on some very admittedly pretty sparse data that we have. It's a contaminant, so it's even harder than normal to find out what products it's in. But as you can see, so that yellow line is the 1 ppm, kind of proposed threshold that we threw out there. And for most of these products, there are some products that are above the 1 ppm, and then there are some that are below that 1 ppm for most of them. So it kind of alludes to that bimodal distribution that Andre talked about at the last meeting. So with 1,4-dioxane in particular, with the AAT, it's a really challenging compound to measure due to its volatility and miscibility with water, which can lead to low recovery. So there's no validated method in consumer products. And as I mentioned, while this is the case for 1,4-dioxane, it's probably going to be the case for most of the chemicals that we would go after for an AAT in the future. So this is kind of where that conceptual part comes in, that even though this is 1,4-dioxane, we're trying to think about how to address this, overall with the types of chemicals that we're going to probably be dealing with. But we did do some outreach to contract labs, as proposed last time, and the survey of product testing data results indicated that a PQL of 1 ppm might be reasonable. So as you can imagine, we got a lot of feedback. It was very helpful. So I wanted to kind of run over some of those concerns because that informs the questions that we have for you. So the first, we heard very clearly that DTSC should provide a validated method for responsible entities to use. And this includes interlaboratory testing and all the works to validate the PQL. They also indicated that it would be extremely expensive for smaller companies to measure down to 1 ppm. I know Helen brought up last time about the expense to smaller companies. And there was also concern that there was a lack of data sharing on 1,4-dioxane levels in the supply chain. Mike, I know you brought this up last time about with a contaminant like this, it's not the final formulators who are actually responsible for it being there, and they really don't have as much knowledge. And some of them were concerned that it was just really hard to know how much 1,4-dioxane was in the surfactants that they're purchasing. The cleaning industry in particular brought up the issue of concentrated products. They highlighted the environmental benefits of concentrated products, things like reduced packaging and reduced transportation costs, but a concern about the fact that they are so concentrated makes it even harder for them to meet an AAT of something like 1 ppm than another product that's a little more diluted. They also highlighted the evolution of surfactants across the over the last few decades and the environmental benefits of the current use of phthalates that we have right now. So things like environmental degradation, and it's a lot milder on the skin than some of the non-ethoxylated surfactants. There was also concern about just the availability of surfactants that have low 1,4-dioxane concentrations. If everyone today said, I want 0 to as low as you can get 1,4-dioxane surfactants right now, surfactant manufacturers probably wouldn't be able to provide that. And then there was concern that the listing a personal care or cleaning product with 1,4-dioxane will result in a tremendous amount of data submitted to the department. Because if you think about those products that we listed, they represent a really large number of responsible entities and a large number of products. So we need your help. It raised a lot of really important questions that, like I said, we've been grappling over ourselves the last few months. And as I mentioned, this is applicable to 1,4-dioxane, but it's also applicable to other future priority products that we might list, where we would have to do an AAT because it's a contaminant, or even we would voluntarily do an AAT, which is an option for things that are not contaminants. We did provide some very preliminary pros and cons in your background document just to kind of stimulate thinking, because you haven't been in the weeds with this as we have over the last few months, but that's just kind of a first pass at it just to kind of get thinking going. So to that end, I wanted to go over some of the questions that we have to the panel and provide just a little bit of context, because even after reading them the last few days, I realized if you're not as in the weeds with them as we are, it might be a little hard to get kind of what we're getting at. So the first question, though, is fairly straightforward. Should we move forward with an AAT and proposing a priority product for something like 1,4-dioxane if there is no validated test method? And if not, what role should SEP play in ensuring that there is a validated test method? What are the implications of waiting for method validation? Because that can obviously take a long time. And if a validated method is needed, how can we get others, manufacturers and contract labs, to help do the work for us, if you will, given our resource constraints and their special knowledge? So there's the validated method approach. There's also an approach, I know Kelly brought some of these up last time, about specifying data quality criteria that people must meet when they give us a report. So instead of saying you must use this method, we say instead you just have to meet these specific data quality criteria. So what would be the implications of taking that route? There's financial implications, there's enforceability implications, so that's kind of a wide range. And then the concept of dilution calculations has also come up. So allowing manufacturers as one means of showing that they've met the AAT to get from their surfactant manufacturers, if they can, their 1,4-dioxane concentrations. They know the amount of surfactant in their final product, and they can calculate the final concentration based on that. So there's obviously concerns about that, because there may be, we've heard last time from 7th generation, there may be product chemicals that you don't think would be contaminated, but may have been cross-contaminated because of the manufacturing process. So there's obviously some pros and cons to that approach as well. The question about how to address concentrated products. What would be, we highlighted how ARB addresses it, which is to allow kind of a dilution calculation based on the minimum dilution in the instructions. But what are the pros and cons of this approach? And we'd love to hear any other ideas on how to address concentrated products. And then there's this concept of this progressive AAT, which we threw out there last time as well. So that would be where we kind of outline in our proposal, okay, year 1, the AAT is 5, and then year 3, it's 2, and then after that, it's 1, and we kind of outline this time frame over which the AAT would get progressively lower. So what are the implications of this approach? When should we consider doing this approach? And how does this align with the goals and values of SEP? Because if we did that, we're kind of saying we don't want AAs. We're going to help you get to the point that we don't get an AA, could be kind of one way to interpret that. So how does that sync up with kind of how the SCP program is structured? And then finally, should we consider approaches to narrow the number of responsible entities for a product? So this was, we could possibly say, instead of just laundry detergents, we could say 1,4-dioxane in laundry detergents containing anionic ethoxylated surfactants, because those are the ones that are most likely to have the highest 1,4-dioxane concentration. So that, of course, takes a lot of research on our end to try and figure out exactly which classes of chemicals and surfactants are most likely to have it, but could maybe be an approach to limit it to those that are most likely to have the highest 1,4-dioxane concentration, with the understanding that we would not get everyone that might have 1,4-dioxane in that product. So what are the pros and cons of that? And in what instances, even beyond 1,4-dioxane, should we consider listing approaches to narrow the responsible entities to maybe focus on just one kind of subgroup of a category? So I think that is all of the questions that we have, just a few. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much. At this point, are there any clarifying questions for Ann Cooper based on her presentation or the supporting documents? Just as a reminder, if your questions are questions more suited for the panel discussion, please wait until then. I see Helen has her name turned up. Helen?
Hi, I had a question around your first question of should you move forward with an AAT for a contaminant. Can you talk a little bit about what actions are you talking about when you say move forward?
Yeah, and even as I probably should have said, should we move forward in listing or proposing a priority product? Because when we propose a priority product, we at the same time have to propose the AAT. So should we move forward in proposing that if there's not a validated method? Or should we wait until there is a validated method and we could include that validated method in the proposal?
Kelly.
I've got two questions. The first one is you asked about the idea of kind of phasing down the allowable concentration. And I'm just wondering, is there anything in the regs that allows like a time frame if you're going to do a notification, one of the notifications that gets you out of doing an AA, and I'm not remembering the exact name, or the ability to say we're going to take it out, but we're not going to take it out for 3 years because we need to get our suppliers to help us, or is the only route to get the time in AA?
I think, and Andre or Ann Cooper, one moment. There we go. I think the thought is that the listing of the priority product would define when something would come in to regulation, and that would be based on the concentration. So we could structurally say that the priority product defined was those which had concentrations, at 5 or above for year 1 to 2, and then ratchet that in so that it would.
You could do that. I'm
Yes.
just wondering if there's anything on the other side
Like
that the
chemical removal
manufacturers could do.
intents and chemical removal notifications, and there's like
Yeah.
90 days, I think, between those. Like you don't have a ton of time between. You can say I intend to do this, but I think the time in which you have to say okay, I've done it, I think is only something like 90 days.
That's 90 days.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we don't, that kind of, what's in the regs right now doesn't afford the opportunity to say, I'm going to have to work with my suppliers and it's going to take 2 or 3 years.
I don't
Correct.
think so.
Yeah,
Well,
okay.
we can specify the due date, so I guess we can delay the due date.
There's the due date for the AA.
Yeah, I think that the general answer we'd have to look at is that
Yeah.
we, within our regulatory authority, we have a lot of latitude to define what the product is, when the regulation takes effect, and who's captured by it. So I think that combination gives us some options. But your point's a good as well.
So I was actually just trying to ask the question, but I guess it's a point. The other question I had is that I remembered and actually went and looked up the code section that there was a law passed maybe 10 years ago that gives DTSC the authority to require chemical analysis methods to be developed. And I'm just wondering if you guys had thought about that. It's Health and Safety Code sections 57018 through 57020.
Well, that's the same as the call-in. That's the call-in sections.
No, I think
It's different.
No, I
It's
think she's re-
specifically for chemical and analytical methods. Because I looked it up, and it allows the state to require that a method be provided to the agency within 12 months, and it's bigger than DTSC.
Yeah, this is for all Calipa, I believe, and this
Yeah.
is really focused on chemical manufacturers and methods, and that authority does exist. We'd have to look at that to see if that was beneficial. I think the timelines on that, if I recall, are fairly long.
12 months.
Yeah,
It's the same
and-
as the statutory calling authority that we have, not the one in the regs, but the overarching California calling.
yeah.
So I just was wondering if you had thought about how that might mesh with this.
And I think that would kind of also be the same question of who's doing the method. I mean, we've found that people that can get down to 1 ppm, but not everyone does it the same way. At least with 1,4-dioxane, everyone's got kind of little variations on how they do it. I mean, that's definitely something to look into, but I'd be curious as to who would get the, who's asked to do, who are we asking to do that?
Well, so let's come back and talk about that, but I just wanted to clarify whether that was part of this. Thank you.
Becky and Blake.
I have two questions. The first is just if you could provide a little more of a definition on a validated method, or maybe some examples.
This is, you tell me. A little bit was, we just heard from industry that we should be providing a validated method. And there's obviously a whole gamut of probably what that means. The sense that we got from stakeholders at the meeting was, a round robin, multiple lab, everyone has the same method, they all do it, that kind of approach. I'm sure there are smaller versions of that we could probably try. But that was kind of what we got from industry when we met with them in August.
Becky, before you ask your second question, can I do a follow-up on that? So you mentioned during your presentation that you said developing a validated method would take a long time. What exactly is a long time? Are we talking about weeks, years?
Year more.
I don't know. I mean, you would have to get the method that everyone agrees on, right? And then you'd have to do the round robin testing and all that stuff. So it would definitely take at least a year. I don't know, Jennifer.
Yeah, it really depends on what you're looking for and extent of a validating method in the first place, like how many criteria points are you putting on there, and then how many people do you have participating, and do you have all of the available resources to do that. So it could be, if you have everything, it could be a couple months versus a couple years.
It depends on how wide you leave the scope, because the different product matrices are going to require different analytical methods. So how many methods are you validating could explode that.
Yeah, I think that's one of our discussion points.
Yeah, perhaps we can follow up during the discussion part of this. Because certainly, I think from industry, we have some experiences on how fast or how slow, how much time it takes, in fact, to go through this whole process. Becky, you have another question?
Yeah, one question that was a follow-up on your example of laundry detergents with anionic surfactants. So since this is a contaminant, if you didn't narrow that and you just said laundry detergents, would every single laundry detergent need to be tested to show that?
Pretty much everyone that makes laundry detergents, I think, would have to report. They'd either have to give us an AAT notification or they'd have to do an AA.
Okay.
So you can imagine that would get pretty expansive.
And do you?
Aha. I think I'm sort of continuing the theme. I was going to ask, what's the landscape of, where is the method validation for this right now? Like, who's doing it?
I mean, FDA published a paper right before our workshop, July maybe, where they did some personal care and cleaning products, and we've heard some industry that that might be a doable method. Mm-hmm. We've talked to others that do kind of a completely even different method than what the FDA's done. So there's some kind of trends, but there doesn't seem to be one way. I mean, some of it depends on, and sorry, this is getting a little chemistry-ish, but what instrumentation you have in your lab. Some people do headspace analysis, but if you don't have a headspace set up in your lab, you can't do headspace, so then you do the direct injection. And so some of that kind of depends on who's doing the testing and what they have in their lab.
So it might be interesting in our discussion to figure out what role DTSC might play in moving this along if this is something we want to do.
Excellent. Excellent point, Ann. Thank you. Are there any more clarifying questions for Ann Cooper? If not, let's move into the discussion part of the alternative analysis threshold based on Anne's presentation and the background information and supporting documents. We'll start with reactions to the questions provided by SCP, and I'll this time make Tim go last. I'll start with Kelly. Kelly, would you like to start?
Sure, I can start. I have a bunch of thoughts here. One of them is that I think the state might want to take a look at the data collection, the laboratory method authority. And I just pulled it up and was looking at it while the Q&A was going on. And it is not exactly a perfect match, but it seems like it's a tool that might be available. So it does require that any method conform to NELAP standards. So that's actually a pretty high bar. So that's for what it's worth. That I've seen a lot of agencies dealing with this question and different kinds of responses. I think a lot of, like in the water world, they'll ask wastewater dischargers or other dischargers to come up with a method. And they're thinking about something that's going to be required for monitoring, so there's a market for commercial labs to keep selling it. So in that arena, I've even seen the Central Valley Water Board has issued basically requests for qualifications to labs to show they can measure some pesticide or some other pollutant at some reporting limit. But the problem, and labs are incentivized to do that because if they're among the ones with the lowest reporting limits, then they get a big share of the market for the future monitoring. But I'm not sure that is a real good model here because I'm not sure how much monitoring, it's sort of a one-time testing kind of thing. But it does strike me as something that it probably gets done by a commercial lab and not, in a lot of cases, and not by the manufacturer in a lot of cases. And that's something to think about because that shifts a lot of people are probably thinking about, I'm going to do this in my own lab and come up with my own method. But if you're looking for certain kinds of QA standards, particularly if you're looking for an environmental testing kind of QA standards, it's a really different kind of lab that does that. So that usually winds up being a commercial lab and a different set of things. So I'm kind of hesitant to throw out the let's do an RFQ model just because I'm not sure there's enough business that comes out of it at the far end, unless there's some sort of thought that manufacturers are going to have to continue to do process control or product control. So that's a huge issue. Let's see, the other kind of big thing here is the phase down thing. So that's something I think is also a really big idea here. And that, to me, it seems like it's a conversation with manufacturers about suppliers. If manufacturers really want to go the phase-out route, then thinking about the time frame for that supply chain change is really important. And what I learned from the brake pads, everyone's going to make fun of brake pads, but something I learned there that I think is a theme that applies elsewhere is that the reason the brake pad stuff included a phase down was because there was a concentration at which there was known technology to get there. So for pretty much everybody could figure out how to get to that technology, and that the lowest standard was technology forcing. So that was why there was a two-step process there. Here it seems that it's really more about getting the supply chains. If that's really what you're asking about, is there going to be supply chain availability of ingredients that are low enough in dioxane? And so having a sufficient time to be able to get the supply chain there is a different thing, and it's more about products shifting from one to the other than some downhill transition where everybody kind of mixes their supplies. That doesn't seem likely. So the phase down idea seems to me like a less perfect fit than something that is thinking about what the supply chain can provide. I've got some more specific thoughts, but I think those are the biggest, basically trying to call in and use some requirements. Actually, the one other thing I probably should say now is that the whole idea of the labs and the Roundrobins and that kind of stuff, that doesn't seem like the right role here. And that's, again, I've seen that in the compliance context. but there's going to be a market for the labs, and they're interested in participating in the round robin because of the market that they would get. In this case, since it's kind of a one or small number of times test, there's not a market for commercial labs to be part of that system. And so it doesn't have the same workability here. So those are my thoughts.
Kelly, thank you very much. Becky?
I just had a couple thoughts regarding question 4 about data quality criteria. I think whether it's a validated method or not, you are going to want data quality criteria. You need to have the full data and the QA data to be able to evaluate whether the lab performed well. So that, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to get around that by just specifying a validated method. And then to question 1, I don't think that you can wait for validated methods. There's going to be very few for consumer products, and it does take, I would say, in my experience watching them go through the process, it takes years to get all the way through to kind of a standardized method with one of those acronyms attached to it. So I just don't see that as reasonable if we really want to speed up the program and make progress.
That's a really good point. I think we should come back to that after we go through the preliminary reactions to the questions. Mike?
And I just want to say thanks to the staff for all the work they've done and the pre-work. It was fascinating reading. This has been a topic I've been very aware of since the 80s. And it's a very difficult one to address because it is a contaminant. And so if you're looking for a validated test method in order to review this, you're going to be looking at testing for every single lot of every single product that is produced because that contaminant level will vary based on each raw material. So the amount of data coming in and how to examine it and how to then place that in an AA. Is the appropriate way for an AA then to say, okay, well, I'm going to buy a source that guarantees me that the 1,4-dioxane level in this surfactant is below 4 ppm because I use it at less than 25% of my product. Does that become a very easy AA to write? If you say that, I don't know, because do you ever really guarantee it's below that? And that was my train of thought until I read the data, because now you're very definitively pointing out that there is background 1,4-dioxane that's possible to get in products that you wouldn't expect. If you've got a manufacturer in Southern California and they're drawing from the water table there, and many of these products are, the bulk of it is water, are they already at a great disadvantage? Now they've got to do something with their water supply because it's coming in that way.
That got brought up at our meetings.
And so, because I really like the thought, okay, maybe we start with a statistical method, except the statistical method only works if you can pinpoint all your raw materials and say, here's the level of 1,4-dioxane in that. We're taking away here are the likely characters. If we truly want to say we're going to have a full product, not go to the raw materials, in the ideal world, this isn't necessarily something that DTSC would approach under the Safer Consumer Products program because it's really a raw material issue. So, ideally, would it be addressed at EPA under TSCA reform? But that's not something we can force, so how do we make it happen, right? But, so I think the work that you've done is very thought-provoking, and I think there are ways to move forward. I do think that looking at a contaminant like 1,4-dioxane is a value-added activity by the agency. I just struggle with how are you going to get to a real reduction versus people saying, okay, well, we've reduced it from this source, but are you really hitting the product? Because that analytical method is going to be all over the place because the products that you're looking at are going to each require a different method.
Mike, thank you. Anne?
Okay. You might have your Green Ribbon Science Panel members trained on technology yet. not sure what I can add here because the weedy stuff is kind of beyond my expertise, so I'll leave that to the experts in the room. But I would strongly agree with Kelly that I don't think DTSC should be in the business of developing a test method, but would definitely need to be part of the discussion to assure that the method meets the needs of our regulations. So I'm not quite sure what else we could do except perhaps serve a convening role as we have in the past, saying this is the state of the landscape of method development. What do you all want to do about this? How do we move it forward? And, providing the driver, I think we should go ahead with listing a product, even though there isn't necessarily a method, just to drive that methodology forward, if that's a useful way. Jumping to another question, the issue of using the concentrated products, I like the CARB approach. And we are talking about consumer products here. I do have a concern. We've had issues with worker exposure to concentrated products, cleaning products particularly in the past. So some caution about that. Not sure how we handle it. I agree that you should probably limit the scope of the AAT as described. I think the work of figuring out what that is probably worth it rather than getting a gazillion AAT notifications. You had a couple of references in here, and I can't find them right now, but when I was looking at it before, you had some concerns about doing something in this context, setting an unfortunate precedent for some future work. I think I wouldn't worry about that because these are also contextual, that whatever your data quality criteria or setting a progressive AAT or anything that's going to set a precedent, I think that's fine, that it's appropriate for this particular product and chemical combination. I like the idea of a progressive AAT as long as it parallels the progress in removal methods and detection methods. So I think that's appropriate, that we could do that progressive approach because it's acknowledging what's out there in terms of removal technology and also measurement technology. I'm not going to turn that off, so you can just choose it yourself.
Thank you. Elaine?
So there's two things. I mean, I'm definitely struggling with the AAT on the products because I'm just struggling with this issue of supply chain. So there's two things. One is developing methods and who should develop methods. And I think this issue is not going to be unique to this at all. I mean, I keep thinking of it in the context of PFAS in rugs. And the reason that keeps coming to my mind is that, you're getting ready to, you have a profile on PFAS in rugs, and many of the manufacturers are taking out PFAS, or so they think, right? Mm-hmm. And how do they know? They don't, right? And in fact, even manufacturers who've been extremely progressive and worked very hard to do this in their supply chains and have their own testing, other people are testing and putting out reports showing that some of their products do contain PFAS. So whose methods do you believe, and how do people know if they can't measure it, or if there's not a way to measure it, or nobody's, you know what I'm saying? So this problem is just going to get, in my head, this whatever you do here or don't do here, this problem isn't going to go away on methods and who should be developing methods. And I just struggle with is that the product manufacturer needs to know something about their supply chain, and they need to demand that the supply chain, be providing them with materials that meet their specifications, right? So anyway, I think I'm going pretty off grid as usual. That's kind of it's my thing. But what's a validated method, and who what the AA would be on is a little. I think this is a really important problem that you're grappling with. So I would agree that there isn't going to be a validated method that can go across every product matrix, and how you do this is going to be really interesting. Yeah, sorry. No, I'm sorry.
Elaine, thank you. Helen?
Okay. I really do think that there needs to be a validated method. As someone who's tried to comply in cases without it, it creates more work than just doing it, truly. Just do it. Yeah, that's sort of just right off the bat. So then there's this question of sort of how long things will take, and the concern about like slowing things down. So this was just something that the more I was thinking about it, the development of the method actually, as long as that's publicly kind of conveyed that that's happening, has the same signaling effect. So I don't think you have to worry about it. I wouldn't start listing something without a method. I would say, hey, we're starting to develop this method, and you're going to have the same effect. And all the same people are going to get involved. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. And sort of another piece of that is if you did announce without a method, you might end up with some methods you don't like, and you're kind of stuck with them for a lot longer than you want. We definitely have at least one case of that going on right now, and that's just very frustrating because people are making decisions that have continued to use a substance that we don't want because the test says it's fine. And you do not want to be in that situation. You want to be from the get-go making sure that whatever your goal is, that you're actually going to get compliance to that goal. And then finally, on the moving the goalposts, I think it might be different in different cases. So back to is it a precedent or not? From a compliance management perspective, I have always found that very challenging to manage over time, to have something moving over time. So I think if there's a compelling reason because of a bridge, like Kelly was talking about, where you need a step to get you someplace, I think then in those cases it's going to make sense. But in general, having rolling dates is a lot of work because you're going to have some product that's complying now, it becomes non-compliant. How do you have to track what's out in the market or what you've got in your warehouses? It's just very, very difficult to manage. So unless there's a really compelling reason, I just wouldn't do that. I agree, you still need the data quality no matter what you do, but if you just do the method, then you're going to cover that. And I think those were the major points. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Tim?
Thanks. I find myself kind of in the same position Anne is, which is like most of my expertise, or none of my expertise is in the area of, validation or data quality, but I do have some thoughts in terms of, designing policy in this way. So I was looking at the different, your menu of approaches and the pros and cons, which I thought was tremendously helpful and thoughtful. What you did here shows a lot of kind of clear thinking about this. I really like product level data option 2, select data quality criteria for a couple of reasons. So I kind of think of this like, okay, so your goal is you don't want this stuff in these products generally, right? For lots of reasons. Mainly, Mike makes a great point about the kind of this cycle where it's in the products and it goes into the water. Now it's in more products because people use the water to make other products. So there's this vicious cycle. So if you believe that this is an important initiative, to deal with this, then I think the difficulties about the PQL should not stand in the way of listing this product. And there's this kind of interesting drift because, as I understand it, the PQL is really about whether you do an alternatives analysis or not, right? And functionally, maybe that translates into whether you have to remove the material from the product or not. But the way I think about it is, if you don't do anything under the regs, it would be up to the responsible entity to say, I'm below the PQL for this material. Right? The regs essentially just use PQL as the standard, am I right? And it says
alternatives analysis threshold, whatever it is.
It is. It's going to be the PQL unless you do something.
Right.
And the PQL is whatever for a particular testing method is determined to be the PQL of that testing method. So there are testing methods because you have you're referring to data for a whole bunch of products where you have broken out, here's what the level is. So somebody's using, there are methods out there, and those methods have PQLs, I'm assuming.
It's just which PQL do you
Which
pick?
one, right? So what I like about 2 is it gives manufacturers the option to pick their test method and then say what the PQL is, right? And of course, that's what you mean by, in PROS, gives REs options for product analysis. And if you have these data quality criteria, that gives you some control over making sure it's not some kind of ridiculous test method, right? So I like that. And there are the cons, right? The industry resistance is you would prefer a validated test method. Okay, wouldn't we all? But I don't think the fact that you like that should justify not getting going on this material if you think it's really that important, right? So you have a way forward, but I think there's a way maybe to responding to that preferred test method notion, which would be, well, great, maybe in concert with this, you could make some efforts to create an initiative where those folks who are impacted by this can get together and try and figure out a standard test method and propose that to you to kind of like, I mean, let the industry figure out in an efficient way how to respond to this. Just like there's consortiums for AAs, maybe there would develop a consortium to develop a standard test method, and that could be presented. So, I mean, in a way, it's like if you build it, they will come. So if you say you get out of doing the AA, if you have a method and there's a PQL, and if you want to have a standard method, we'll go make one, and that switches the resources onto the responsible entity. So that's why I like that one, but I think I would suggest trying to figure out other vehicles by which you could engender cooperation and collaboration to do that. But having said all that, I do like this progressive idea, because what it does is like, if you just like essentially list everything, that creates this mishigas, right? Everybody's running around trying to figure out what to do. So if you kind of took a sliver of those, so maybe if there's a way of articulating a set of products which are of most concern and which are unlikely to get below any PQL, right? And you start with them, then that gives people time to worry about test method. Like the folks who know they're next, it'll give them time to think about what their test method would be, while at the same time you're getting to going on the ones that this isn't going to make any difference for them. I don't know if you can do that. Maybe it's just not, right? And maybe it's not by setting a PQL, but by setting a, like you said, Carl, you have ways you can slice and dice what your priority product combination is in ways that maybe could allow you to do that. Which brings me to Helen's point, which is, yeah, but there's this moving target and that creates all sorts of problems for you. But I was struck that it seemed like there was like a little bit of internal conflict in what you said, Helen, in that you like, though, the idea of signaling things to people. So if people know something's coming, they can get working on it. And I think like a progressive approach that kind of tries to capture folks who you can get to, who won't really use a PQL, but the signal is, hey, you guys are next, and if you don't want to be in this mess of having to figure out individually, get together and figure out a method, that builds in some time in the system for that to happen. So hopefully that would address these concerns that you have, legitimate concerns about, like now I'm compliant, now I'm not compliant. It's not really a compliant, not compliant. It's you don't have to do an AA now, but you're going to have to do one in X number of years unless you establish a standard method and you're under that PQL. So anyhow, I talked a lot longer than I thought I would, but that's kind of at a conceptual level, that's how I'm thinking about it.
Thank you. Elaine, you wanted to follow up on those comments?
Yes. Okay. So thank you for reminding me of the table. So I think what I'm what I'm actually probably arguing for or wanting to understand more about is the ingredient level option and what that would mean, because to me that's potentially the most could have the most impact across the board for what you all are doing. I'm just wondering how that would, maybe you could just say a little more about how that might work or what issues you would have around it beyond just the pros and cons, maybe just in terms of how you would implement that or what that would look like?
So that's like the statistical, the calculation approach. So it kind of shifts the burden up to the surfactant manufacturers.
Right.
So then we would hope that they would supply information about 1,4-dioxane to the formulators.
Because then you're going with one method.
So it does make the method a little easier because then the method is further up the supply chain and your PQL can be a lot higher because the surfactant can be 10 ppm. If you're diluting it, you can still get to 1. Do you see what I'm saying? So you don't need as sensitive as a method at the surfactant level.
You don't need as sensitive and you have one matrix.
Right.
And you're doing the work on the supply chain, which is a lot of
where you want
for these, especially for formulations where people reformulate every 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. And we've talked, and some concerns about that is we've talked to some surfactant manufacturers, and a lot of them do the testing, some do and don't disclose it, but a lot of times they will just give you a range, is what I've heard, like it's less than 10. So there are some, if you did rely on that approach, if you're a manufacturer, a formulator, and you said, I'm going to go that approach because I don't want to deal with the testing, it's probably going to be a worst case scenario your calculation is. So that's kind of a, this
Can I just follow up on that? One of Ann Cooper's comments is that, thank you. As Ann Cooper indicated in some of our discussions with manufacturers, that they said, there's a range where we can less than 10. And we've heard informally from some of the trade organizations that, they're trying, as Mike points out, this is not a new issue. And so some of the trade organizations are saying, we'll have our own informal standard, and 10 is a number we've heard. So my question is really for Mike in terms of, from a practical standpoint, how has that evolved? And in this issue of signaling back to the suppliers what your needs are, is that something, how long has that taken, and what do you as a consumer of those surfactants see the potential for us to influence?
So it works well if industry through a trade association says we want this. If a large company says we want this, going back to manufacturers, because you can manufacture a lower level. That's why they're just different grades of surfactants. I think it's evident in the information that you pulled that certain industries have already done that. The baby wipes. There was an effort quite a while ago to lower the level in baby wipes. Difficult because it wasn't just the surfactants bringing it in, it was potentially the non-woven fiber in the baby wipes that could be bringing in the 1,4-dioxane. But when you look at the data, you see that also lower. So it is effective for industry, for the consumer products industry, to go back to their suppliers, either as individuals or as a consortium, and say, here's what we need. And it might drive costs up, but it might be a preferable way to say, we're going to do this and do it that way and really hit those raw materials, then try and address it at a later state, and realizing that it's going to be variable. Even if you've got the test method, you're going to be analyzing each lot and how are you going to control certain lots from then coming into California versus other states.
Thanks. Kelly.
Sure. The conversation here is leading me towards the idea of the chemical analysis method being the starting point. And looking at the law, I mean, the state is actually allowed to request that of the chemical manufacturer. So if there are, as you're talking about certain ingredients and so forth, then that would push the manufacturers towards putting together a consortium to provide responses. And the advantage of going upstream is that then you're getting more of the same thing. If you're looking at ethoxylated surfactants, then it's not a mix of ingredients with all those different interferences, and the separation problem is simpler. So the sample preparation before doing the measurement. So it does seem that, I guess I'm kind of agreeing with what a bunch of other folks are saying here, that it would be worthy of exploration whether that authority might be a good next step before going all the way to the listing process. And then if so, which chemicals would you try to, would you require this for? You know, would it be anything other than ethoxylated surfactants that you'd want to do that with? So that, and that helps set up some of the things that have worked in other contexts. A couple of examples that I'm familiar with for pesticides, when the pyrethroid insecticides first became an issue, they were very difficult to measure, and also the sampling protocols and the sample cleanups were really complicated. And so Department of Pesticide Regulation went to USGS and said, can you develop all of this for us? And so they went to a really high quality laboratory that did a really nice job on this. I could totally see. They did pay them. So, and the same thing. And the same thing is happening now with microplastics. That the water board has gone to Squirp and given them a little bit of money, and then they're working with other labs. But I could, if you're requesting a specific enough method from a group of manufacturers, then that would incentivize the manufacturers to do this process instead of either with their own labs if they really think they need to do it themselves, or with commercial labs. Whereas the state doesn't have the resources, and the law is structured in a way that it shouldn't be the state's job to do that. I mean, I'm pretty clear about that, both the Safer Consumer Products Law and this chemical analytical method requirement law were specifically passed by the legislature as a policy to say that those things should be funded by manufacturers and not by state taxpayer dollars. So that's...
I have Mike and then Helen.
So if this is, I'm following Elaine's lead and really branching off here. Curiosity on this. New York has a bill regarding 1,4-dioxane, and it's a progressive bill. Have you been following? I mean, part of me thinks, okay, with the resources, is it the best bang for your buck here if New York is going to take the lead on this one? Is it more worth your while to kind of watch what they're doing and then build on it later while you develop the plans versus trying to do something at the same time? I'm just curious as to how closely you're monitoring or in contact with New York State.
Yeah, so they were actually, Adrienne Esposito, who was with the Citizens Campaign for the Environment, who was the group that kind of pushed the bill, she was on our panel for our August workshop. So she brought in some perspective. And actually, when they set their equivalent of an AAT, it was a very different process. They just kind of threw it out there. So, very different process. But we've definitely thought about it. And we actually have heard from manufacturers that the fact that both New York and California are making noise on 1,4-dioxane is actually getting a lot of attention. So we were at a conference a few months ago, Yuko and I were, and we heard clean surfactants are coming next year, because they've heard. So I think there might be some value in kind of both ends going at it. And we also don't know if that bill is going to get signed.
Right.
And they've got some different allowances. Yeah, we've definitely been following it. And actually, we considered that in our discussion proposal for the AAT. We alluded to the levels that they threw out there.
Mike, I think it's, we work fairly hard, both staff and management level, to coordinate with our fellow states, both through the Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse and directly. And Cooper highlighted, the New York efforts are legislative. And that's a very different process for which our colleagues at the New York Department of Environmental Quality don't actually control, much like we don't here. But I think Ann Cooper's point is really good, is that in the industry, people are paying attention. And so I think collectively, a lot of the input we've gotten is helpful, because as we pull the strings on these approaches and tools, I think we will be sending the message to all the stakeholders that we're interested in this and it's moving forward. And so some of this for us this is very helpful, I think, in terms of, as Ann Cooper laid out, we have a variety of options. There are other authorities as well that might inform us. But it's really about where's that sweet spot if we believe that we really want to keep moving on this and that it's meaningful and valuable. And so I just am kind of affirming that this is very helpful to us to think of not just what tools, but the arc of the time frame and the bigger picture, because much as PFAS is getting all kinds of attention, and thankfully, right, that there's a lot of movement and a lot of fronts. So it's helpful for us to figure out where we best fit in that overall, and not just assume that it's all on us to move the dial. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Helen?
I want to come back to a point that Mike and others have made about the nature of lot-to-lot variation over time. And in some ways, it's not so much about the AAT questions in particular, but maybe a bigger question of what sort of monitoring do we kind of anticipate in cases like this? Because it's definitely not a one-time. What'll happen is you might have a snapshot in time when it's on everybody's mind that it's going to, people are going to be largely compliant. And then over time, you're going to have non-compliant product being in the market. How do you know what kind of monitoring in this particular kind of case where it's a contaminant that may come and go in the supply chain, depending on what's happening, even in a good supplier's process? I don't know whether we necessarily solved that problem here today, but it did make me think about the regulatory actions that might come out of one of these work streams. And is that something that we need to think about, or how much does that impact the way we would approach this? Because if we choose a test method and we choose a fairly large, set of products, is the regulatory response does it have to be like an ongoing reporting of compliance, or, it's because we know it will change over time?
I think, Helen, the general response to that is that the department's approach to compliance and enforcement, we have that same challenge in all of our aspects. So in the hazardous waste world, there are waste streams that are generated continuously, and we may go in and do an inspection and get a snapshot at that time, and that they are either in compliance or not at that time. So ultimately the burden is on the generator or the manufacturer to be compliant, and our efforts are not going to be continuous monitoring. There are things maybe in the air world I'm not familiar with, where you've got stacked monitors all the time and you get the data and you say, over the last month, did you ever have an exceedance? That's probably not the model we're going to have. We will not have the resources to be able to do that. That said, then our expectation is if that standard is set, that it's on the manufacturer to meet that standard. And at any time that we would look, if you're out of compliance, then we'll take action from there. So recognizing that there is this variability.
Yeah, that was really more the point, is that if something's designed out to not be there, I think it's a reasonable expectation that it will stay not there.
Right.
But this is just something that, because of the nature of the fact that it may come and go within the supply chain, is there anything different that might be in a monitoring, or I don't know. It was just a question that's like, how is this different than something you would design out as a function?
I don't think it's that much different. I think that we've had concerns expressed by stakeholders about, well, how are we going to ensure that for any priority product, that as time goes on, that we ensure that late players don't come into the market that are not compliant. And that's because the people that are making the effort to be in compliance deserve to have a level playing field. We understand that. So we're going to have an ongoing responsibility to monitor everything we're regulating. This kind of relates to the discussion yesterday about that's not accounted for in our base budget and process, and we are very aware that that's a need and it's a responsibility of ours to ensure that the program is both implemented on the front end to be ambitious, but also that we ensure that there's a level playing field and people are compliant.
So let me ask Helen and Mike, so how do your companies make sure that, over time, the materials that are provided to your company for your products, that in fact it meets in this case, let's say your restricted substances list thresholds, because that also changes over time, because suppliers, in terms of how the materials that they provide to you. How did your company do that?
We have systematic ways of when new parts come in, when new products come in, they have certificates of compliance and analytical data that they provide. Yeah. And our products do change relatively quickly, so that's pretty fresh.
Yeah, and we look at it, is we've got a variety of materials, both intentional and contaminants, that we prohibit in our products. We work with our vendors. We keep a limited supply of vendors that we allow for products, and we make them certify that it's below a set limit, and then we spot check when we can to make sure that they continue to comply with that. It's not an always trust, but we audit the vendors. We'll look at their test methods and ensure that they meet what our requirements are. And then we do trust them most of the time to be providing product that's within our specifications, but we will spot check it as needed.
So in terms of making sure that your suppliers are meeting the requirements of your restrictions, I would think that having a validator or you specifying a specific method makes that a lot easier, right?
You want to make sure that you understand the method using. Most of the time, it's a method they have, because most of these contaminants are things that they can test for, or there's an ASTM method or an OECD method. And those exist for a lot of these contaminants if you're looking at a specific chemical compound. It's when you jump up to a product where you've got lots of other things mixed together to interfere that it becomes more difficult. But yes, you want to make sure that you at least understand and have validated to some level the method that they use. We might not be able to replicate it. We might not have the specific equipment it takes, but then we'll know other laboratories we could contract to verify as well.
Thank you very much, Mike. Tim?
It's no longer relevant.
Okay. This is a really interesting conversation. I like Kelly's focus on, I think it's AB 289 you're looking at.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And in a way, when you look at, that requires you to kind of go out and ask for things first and then, and all that. And it feels like you've done a lot of the asking already, except you haven't, I don't know if that's focused on the manufacturer of the chemical, which would not be the detergent manufacturer. It would be the surfactant, I guess, manufacturer, right? So you'd have to, so I'm wondering whether you've asked those manufacturers about what methods they have and those sorts of things. Like, does anybody know about those methods?
Sorry. We have, and we actually have conversations upcoming with them. That's kind of been a process of getting to them. They're a little less visible, a little more behind the scenes. And I know that there are some methods for 1,4-dioxane at the surfactant level, which I think Mike's alluded to. And I know that more of them test at that level than at the the formulator level. So we definitely know that those methods exist. And even in the conference we went to a few weeks ago, I know that they are increasingly aware of it because of the work that's been going on in California and New York. More and more surfactant manufacturers, I think, are starting to get more and more in tune in testing, even if they might not have been before.
Yeah, because it strikes me, I like the idea of that. It gives a little bit of leverage. I get a little worried about kind of the mechanics of it because it asks to test for a chemical, and there's a question about whether testing for the contaminant is part of test. I don't know, because I don't think it's been used that much. I don't know if you have experience in those. And I also wonder, like, how many of those manufacturers are in California and those sorts of things. But I think involving them is a really positive thing to do. I keep coming back to this notion that I don't like the idea of not pursuing a priority product chemical combination because of this PQL issue, just because, for the reason I stated. But then also Helen made me think about something, which would be, if there were a way to structure this so that you're not dealing with a group that is likely to take advantage of the is it AAT, right? I'm wondering whether having them go through the alternative analysis process, think about alternatives, that might kind of move the the industry forward in a way, like you say, these clean things are on the way, right? So it could be that you might never have to face the PQL AAT issue if this is staged out and innovation occurs and safer alternatives where you won't have to worry about the contaminant in it are developed and into the marketplace, it may become less important later on. The issue wouldn't be. So you'd be able to continue to move forward, and maybe it would resolve itself in that sense. I don't know. I mean, these are just kind of things to think about in terms of the dynamics of how the program operates and the impact that it has on the supply chain.
Thank you. Mike and then Kelly.
So I want to jump over to one of the other points that you brought up in the questions on the concentrated products. I just wanted to highly emphasize that I think you need to consider this. There are a lot of reasons for concentrate. I mean, if you look at concentrated products in these product types, there are multiple ways that they exist. The traditional way is traditional for industrial use. So you're going to have a lot of concentrated cleaners, products that go into, say, janitorial services, and it helps with storage as well as transportation and all that. But you're seeing more and more in standard consumer products, those concentrated products come up to address a number of issues like carbon emissions, because it costs a lot less to transport smaller containers that aren't just full of water. Also, plastics, having the smaller containers and refilling plastic containers over and over again solves discarding of plastic. So I think you're going to see a lot more of that, and I think you don't want to say we're not going to look at concentrates and give that some leeway so that you can actually formulate a concentrated product, and thus have an unforeseen consequence of now there's more plastic, there's more carbon emissions, because the Act does require you to look at the full life cycle. So I think you do need to look at that, but I think you also then need to look at, for each priority product combination that you come up with, what is the endpoint that you're looking at? Why are you choosing it? So 1,4-dioxane, you're saying carcinogen, and if that's the case, it's that human exposure. So maybe the concentrate is problematic. Maybe you don't give it a leeway, because if the feeling is that workers or consumers can be exposed to the concentrated level, then you have to look at it for that. But if it's looking at an environmental endpoint, then the way it gets to the environment is because it's in a washing machine or whatever. Does it matter that it's concentrated or not? It's that end-use dilution that should be examined. So I think you're stuck with it being no simple one-size-fits-all answer. But those concentrated products, you have to look at why you're listing it and then what the actual use is. But I think there's a lot of validity, and I think you will see a lot more concentrated products coming on the market. So I think it is an issue that, just like do we look at contaminants like this, do we look at AATs? I think you have to say, how do we, in the program, address concentrated products?
Right. Thank you. Kelly.
So I'm going to join Mike in stating the obvious, in that the analytical method, one of the things you're going to really want through whatever process you use is to make sure that DTSC's lab, there's a method that DTSC's lab can do. Because otherwise you don't have the enforcement method, and that's going to be really important to get your laggards. So that's pretty obvious. You were probably thinking that already, just kind of bringing that up. And the other is that listing eventually, even if you go through the method step, doing the listing process and having manufacturers say, we don't need to do an AA or whatever, then creates the process by which the end-use product manufacturers are accountable in perpetuity, which then incentivizes them to do the control on their suppliers, either as described here or, again, my brake pad role. They use a lot of recycled materials in brake pads. So when you're looking at other kinds of products, this is where we're thinking about this as a general thing. So their supplies do vary quite a bit. So they determined not only did they need to set their specifications so that they would be well below the standard, which I think pretty much any one of the end-use formulators would be doing as part of this, but they also decided that they needed to implement controls on their end products. So they were looking for methods that they could use to scan products and check periodically, not just supplies that come in, but also products going out to make sure that they're in compliant. So they were looking at methods that might not be used for the regulatory compliance, but like, so for example, the chemical analysis method that DTSC's lab worked with brake pad manufacturers on for copper content is a more complicated method than they would want to use to track their manufacturing processes. So they were really interested in XRF, something that they could use as an indicator. So it doesn't rule out, I'm just bringing that up because it doesn't rule out a different method to be used for a different purpose. So a little bit long of an answer, but all I think fairly obvious of the idea of DTSC's lab being able to do the methods that you would be able to check and make sure that this is all actually happening using your authorities to make that happen, to incentivize manufacturers to continue to watch those supply chains, recognizing that you're doing a one-time, particularly if you do a like analytical method, you're doing a one-time thing, but you want this to live on in perpetuity and protect water supplies forever.
Let me just follow up on that. So could I get a better understanding of how the DTSC Environmental Lab is actually involved in this method development conversation? Do you guys have like bandwidth and or?
So we are. This is not something that our lab does routinely. They don't. They do a little bit of product testing for a few things, but and this isn't an analyte that they've done. And we've procured a bunch of samples of products for them to test, and they're working on trying to get a method up that they can run. So that is a good point that Kelly made about a method that our lab can do. Whether we have whether they have the equipment that other people might be using is another question that we need to answer. So there are, to date, we don't have an up and running method at our lab for the types of products we're talking about.
I have Colin.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to the concentrate question. I have some pretty serious concerns about that, actually, just because in some ways I'm concerned that it would almost invalidate the gains that you might get in other types of classes if you have one or two really high runners that you can foresee the misuse of the concentrate. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that people put too much detergent in. This is well known, right? Especially in the U.S. in particular. And so, sorry?
I said more is better, right?
Yeah, more is better, and yeah, so I have some very deep concerns about it, and I completely understand and agree with there are other benefits potentially in a holistic sense, but if we're looking really narrowly at this one contaminant in down the drain situations, I think it's going to be if you go to all this trouble, develop your method, set this 1 ppm, whatever, and someone takes their detergent, glug, 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 their concentrated detergent. I just don't know that you're really getting a meaningful reduction at that point, because the overwhelming signal might be from the things that are going down the drain at this higher concentrate. And so that might be something, though, to mitigate or temper your enthusiasm for wanting to necessarily have a higher allowance for concentrates. The other sort of piece of that might be to limit what classes of products might have a concentrate allowance. So, for example, anything that goes on your skin, you might say, nope, we're not going to allow that higher. There's no concentrate lotion, but they're limited to the very smallest number of product classes or types of materials where there's a demonstrable benefit in packaging, whatever. It's like it would have to outweigh the risk of then taking all of that and running it down the drain at its maximum values. So I just kind of wanted to raise that concern, is that if we allow for the concentrate, it should be the smallest, narrowest, maybe definition of what could come under that, to make sure it's not going to just overwhelm the benefits you might get in other types of products.
Thank you. I have Becky next.
I just had a comment to reinforce what Helen just said. and talking about cleaning products and personal care and thinking about real or realistic exposure scenarios. And this might actually apply more to human health concerns, which, direct exposure human health concerns rather than through the water system, which is a little more of the 1,4-dioxane focus specifically. But just this might be an area where talking with worker communities would provide more realistic exposure scenarios that would inform what kinds of limits you would put on concentrates and how they could be tested and approved for use. And this, in terms of cleaning products, I'm thinking specifically about consumer use cleaning products, or things you can buy at the hardware store. Because I know for institutional industrial cleaning products, often those come up with special containers and equipment that kind of require the custodial staff to dilute them, so there's a little less of a chance of using overly concentrated products or not following the instructions.
Carl?
Thanks, sir. So I have a question, and it's primarily for Helen and Art, is that, we try to be a learning organization and learn from other models and ways things have rolled out. And so Helen stimulated a thought when she mentioned Ross, and that in 2006 or whenever that was, and California for a while had a perspective of bringing Ross compliance into California. Anyway, that I think was an interesting exercise in looking at a well-intentioned law from the EU, but from the standpoint of implementation, how you measure the homogeneous materials in every component in an electronic device at the specified limits. When we looked at that, and Andre may recall better, is that we felt it was almost impossible from a technical standpoint to actually assess compliance with that directive. And so I don't think it's that dissimilar. I mean, it's a manufactured product, but it was looking at a very specific standard and then go for it. And so I'm just curious, do you think there are lessons learned from the Ross implementation that translate here at the macro level or even more specifically? I just think, because I know that a huge amount of effort has been put through that process.
Yeah, and that was actually when I mentioned that we are kind of stuck with some methods and in some cases, that was exactly what I was talking about. I was thinking hexavalent chromium, right? So that was, there wasn't, the test method that was, that we had kind of at the beginning was really not ideal. And so you had a homogeneous material definition, but a test method that was looking at per square, for an aerial coating. So it was mixing the methods, and we've been stuck with this unfortunate, somewhat conflicting situation because they got ahead of it, right? They got ahead of that test method. And I just don't want to have that happen here. And that's why I'm kind of a stickler on needing a test method or a set of test methods, because if we want to comply, we want to comply. And so I need to know, I can't measure intention. I don't like intentionally added. I've never liked that phrase because I can't measure that. What I want to be able to do is take a thing that a supplier sends to me and test it and know, does this meet the requirement? And to get ahead of a test method, like I said, it causes problems because you might have someone who genuinely wants to comply. And the hexavalent chromium is an interesting example of that, because you could actually have a trivalent process that ends up with hexavalent at the end, right? And because this test method is just not really what I would like to have, it makes it really hard for us to be confident that when we're getting results from a supplier or from a test house, that it's accurate. So, if I could do something different, I would have a better test method from the get-go, set the limit appropriate to that test method, that I could have a higher confidence that what I was getting really met the goal of trying to get rid of that process.
And you, I assume, worked with all your suppliers, of which there were multitudes, and
Screws,
Right, yeah.
screws. You know how many people make screws in the world?
Yeah.
A lot of companies make screws.
And there's a lot of different kinds of screws, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yes.
I think this issue of how you dealt with your suppliers and what standard they're doing and how it's very parallel to me.
It's exact. It's not exact. Almost exact. Very similar, and a lot of the same problem of variation over time, where if you change you'd like to think you'd have the freedom to change your screw supplier, right? Because you'd like to be able to have that flexibility in your design. But, if you're concerned about this, you don't actually want to be making those changes because you might be concerned that you're not going to get the same level of compliance. I don't know. It's a very, very complicated thing to manage. You don't want to put people who are, trying to comply into that situation. So the clearer the test method, the better you're going to get the good guys who are trying to comply.
And so, given that all of you have the same interest in being compliant, does the Screw Manufacturers Association of North America now are all on the same page and producing RoHS compliant screws?
Oh, definitely not. Definitely not. Yeah, basically, I think a lot of suppliers, and I don't know whether this is going to be true in this case, but a lot of them just said, well, I don't want to sell into the electronics industry because why? I got a lot of people who want my screws for all these other applications. I'm just not going to worry about that. And so it actually didn't move the needle at that industry, at that part of the supply chain. And so that would be a concern also. If you make it really difficult to comply, and there's still a really large market that doesn't require that compliance, it narrows the number of suppliers who can meet that need of the people who are trying to comply.
And then just before, I know Andre has a question or comment. The other aspect of RoHS, which was interesting, is I believe it was meant to stimulate alternatives to lead and other heavy metals. And I know that the industry put a lot of work into looking at alternatives to solders, tin, bismuth, et cetera, with a lot of issues. And where is that now? Has that led to safer alternatives in those?
Well, yes and no, but just starting back to your question about the difficulty in analyzing for the chemical of interest in the different materials that go into electronics products. So there's a couple of things about RoHS that made it kind of somewhat manageable. Was the fact that it started out with a very limited number of chemicals. So that makes it somewhat manageable. And in terms of getting the suppliers on board, in contrast to 1,4-dioxane or surfactants in the laundry detergent industry, the electronics industry, in terms of the size of the industry, it's huge. So there's an incentive for people to come up with RoHS compliant materials for companies like HP and Apple, and that does make a big difference. What was your question about?
Well, about stimulating innovation. So now you have lead-free solders and other things, and it seems like that would be a good thing.
So yes and no. I think that there was. Part of how I ended up actually doing this work is because I had been working on lead-free solders at a time when no one else cared about it. And then when these regulations came, when the legislation was published, all of a sudden there was a lot of interest in lead-free solders, and because there really hadn't been a huge amount of innovation in that space before. All of a sudden, when the legislation was there, it did, I think, cause a lot of people to do a lot of interesting technical innovation around lead-free solders. So that in particular, I'd say yes. There are many more lead-free solders today available commercially than there were 25 years ago when we were working on the problem initially. So I'd say yes in that, almost to the point where there's such a proliferation of different solders that becomes a different management problem. But that doesn't apply here. But in terms of innovation, yes. In that case, yes. It wasn't uniform. in which applications got that level of innovation, I think. Where there were easy changes, people just made them. That just wasn't one. The plasticizers are still obviously kind of, so plasticizers have had a bit of a replacement problem, a regrettable substitution problem kind of going on because not all the orthophthalates were considered at the beginning, and I don't know, so there was innovation, but it took a little while for some of it to maybe get really embraced because of not going by class, back to our class approach. Not going a class approach was a detriment in the orthophthalates because I think it led at least a couple of groups from having to do a couple of substitutions. We did our best to try to encourage the right behavior, but reality is, people make their own choices. Definitely, the flame retardants definitely had a lot of innovation, I'd say. We started to see a lot of oligomeric flame retardants. Even if they remained halogenated, they were in polymeric form. And that was that actually is a step forward. There was definitely innovation, I think, across some of them. I would say, there was. There actually was. It wasn't uniform, though. Does that answer the question?
Uniform across the sector.
Uniform across the applications, because each of the applications had to do kind of their equivalent work of figuring out how do they replace it. So some have, like I said, you can go and say, oh, here's 1,000 different solutions on the solder side, or it feels like it. But there are going to be others where there are fewer replacements depending on the specifics of the application. I don't know, Art, if that captured the...
Yeah, and there's another thing that's associated. And I do think that the Ross directive has had a positive effect when it comes to innovations and safer alternatives. So a pretty good example of that is that 10, 15 years ago, Apple, in partnership with a polymer manufacturer, actually designed and came up with a PVC-free polymer for cables and wires, and that was free of phthalates. Some of the phthalates that Helen was talking about. And Apple at the time decided to make that the design and the information on this PVC-free polymer available. We didn't put a patent on it, hoping to spur industry into going to safer polymers, and unfortunately the uptake was zero because there was a cost differential. Mm-hmm. However, now that all the phthalates are being targeted by Ross, that's driving people to rethink this whole: do I want to use phthalates or specific kinds of polymers? So it does drive towards safer innovations.
Yeah, I would actually add to that one of the things that we found was that before Ross, in the polymer world, there had actually, especially in the PVC space, there had been not a whole lot of innovation. But then when there was interest in the halogen-free alternatives, I saw a big spike in interest in that. And people, it was like overnight, they went from this being sort of this old, high-volume technology that nobody wanted to kind of deal with, to all of a sudden people were doing some very exciting alternatives work. But when you first asked the question, I kind of said yes and no. And the reason that I wasn't 100%, even though there has been all this change, I think that one of the frustrations, at least from my perspective, is that we haven't had enough of the alternatives assessment as part of the innovation. So my team was always trying to do that, trying to make sure that we were checking the replacements. But I don't think that's uniform. I think it's very far from uniform as a practice that if someone's making changes like this, that they're comparing using the best available methods to to have some credible claim that it actually is safer or better for the environment. It's a long-standing sort of frustration that we're spending a lot of money changing all sorts of things out. Are we really, are we sure that what we're changing to is better at the heart of it?
Thank you. I mean, I think in combination with Tim's comment about don't let it stop us from, what part of the challenge we have is looking at the devil's in the details. We don't want to get paralyzed by a technical issue necessarily, that we lose sight of the bigger picture and move forward. So those lessons learned are helpful.
I have Andre, Mike, and then Ann Cooper. Andre?
So that's a nice segue from what I was thinking as I'm listening to this interesting discussion, is when we're talking about compliance here, we're talking about compliance with I don't have to do an AA. We're not trying to use the AAT to drive people to meet the AAT. We're trying to, I think, get people to do alternatives analyses. So I see this as different from Ross in that regard. Mm-hmm. That was the point I've been wanting to make for
it's a really
15,
good point.
20 minutes.
I'm glad you did. I have Mike. Okay, Ann Cooper?
And I changed things a little bit, but...
I don't know if it's on or off.
Great. Okay. 2 points. One, just on the concentrates. So one of the benefits of New York kind of putting their numbers out first is they got the initial backlash about it. And there was a lot of talk about the concentrated products there, and they heard a lot of the trade associations say that people were going to have to start diluting their products. They weren't going to be able to sell concentrates in New York. They were going to have to take their products off the market. So just some perspective on what we've heard from New York about concern about that. So just that. But I had some questions about the impact of this on small businesses. So in a few ways, one, just the ability to either do the analysis themselves or require their suppliers to meet certain standards. And the cost of those, I mean, I know we've heard from surfactant manufacturers that depending on how you control the 1,4-dioxane, it can increase the price of the surfactants. And so it may be that to meet their end budget, they have to buy the ones with more 1,4-dioxane. So are they going to be disproportionately impacted by something like this? And they would be more at risk. Helen, your point about sometimes the suppliers would just say, well, fine, we're just going to not sell to you. And so those, I would think the smaller companies are probably more at risk if something like that does happen. And things like innovation. I know there are some alternatives that are coming up of different alternate surfactants that people can use that don't even use ethoxylation, so it's not even an issue. But I do know that those can be a little more expensive. So just some kind of thoughts on that. We did hear from a lot of surfactant manufacturers, a lot of some trade associations about the concerns. And I do know for small businesses, and I know that for the I&I, the institutional industrial sector, with our work on NPEs, we found out that actually a lot of those are smaller companies, it's what it seems. So kind of small mom and pops that kind of do it on a smaller scale. So if we were to list a cleaning product in particular, it might have some big impact there. So.
Is that an AA consideration or
I guess
do
just
we
think
want
about,
to make small businesses?
Yeah, just kind of the potential impact of how we go forward with this would impact small businesses.
Right.
So kind of in response to that first, I think if you look at a lot of the commentary that's gone on in New York and industry coming back and they're talking it's going to cost billions of dollars, a program like this for a large company will cost a significant amount of money and take us aback. So if you do look down at the smaller companies, if you require testing, they will have no ability to create a validated test method. They're going to have to wait till someone else does it. And even then, these tests aren't going to be, I send it out and it's $100 a pop for every single lot of product I sell. You're probably talking thousands of dollars per test run if they've got to send it out. Otherwise, they're spending significant capital to try and buy equipment that they simply can't afford. So how they would comply in a world where they're testing for contaminants is an excellent question. I don't know if you shape the regulation around that, but it's a valid point. It's going to be very difficult for them to comply with a contaminant-based priority product. Just my thoughts. And if someone has thoughts on that to respond to you, I will wait to my next comment.
Seeing none, go ahead, Mike.
Okay, well, I'm just going to continue stating the obvious then. Elaine and I are both very clear on our modes of operating today. And I'm going to jump over to question 7, which talks about narrowing the scope. And it kind of goes, and Carl was talking earlier. He said, well, maybe we could focus on what we think is the big hitter, anionic ethoxylated surfactants in laundry detergent. And to me, it really goes, and it's kind of what Helen was saying, is do you want to move the needle overall, or are you really looking for an absolute? Because if you're looking, say, we want to truly control 1,4-dioxane and all these contaminants, you can't narrow the scope. But then, do you have an unmanageable program? I don't know how you could actually do the entire scope, the entire world for 1,4-dioxane. And parts of it go back to yesterday. We were saying there's only parts of it that you guys can touch. You can't really address the water issue in Southern California. You can't remove it from the water. That's not in your purview. So to me, I believe that narrowing the scope, if you can not have to do work and take up the entire staff time to come up with the narrow scope, if you can narrow it to here's what we believe, and say it's that anionic ethoxylated surfactants in laundry detergent, whatever, I think the benefit to that is you will move the needle because manufacturers, large or small, tend to, if they've got a surfactant they're using, they'll use it across multiple products as far as they can, and they're not going to say, oh, well, for this one laundry product, the DTSC made a priority product, we're going to spend more money and get the lower 1,4-dioxane. We're going to have 2 warehouse spaces, 2 specifications. It's too much work. It'll simply be across the board in all their products, and you will see the needle moved then to other product types, whether they're priority products or not. And a lot of times what you also see is if we install a specification for something like 1,4-dioxane in one surfactant, we're not saying BASF, we only want this one that's low 1,4-dioxane. It becomes a general specification. So I think you wouldn't move the needle if that's the goal of looking at something like this. If that's not the goal, if it's not to make a slower move, if we're not just safening, as we used yesterday, but we're trying to get the safest, then you have to go the whole route.
Right. Thank you very much. Let me check to see if there are any more comments from the panel members. Not seeing any. We have about 10 minutes before our break. I'm going to offer this time to the staff to see if they have questions that they might want the panel members to touch on. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Michael Ernst. I'm a hazardous substance engineer under Andre Algazi. I also I led the team that revamped our project management toolkit. And thank you for the feedback on that today or yesterday. One of the things that Christine and others mentioned was that often at the onset, we don't know how long something's going to take because we don't know what we're going to find. And one potential approach I've thought about that is instead of saying we want to find out this much, saying we're going to look for 3 months and we're going to find out everything we can. And then we're going to report back and then we're going to decide what we're going to do with the next 3 months. And do we need to pull more strings? Do we put this one to bed? But basically, prior to, I've been with the program for 2 years. Prior to my tenure with DTSC, I was a consultant for 15 years. And prior to that, I worked worked with industry. I'm particularly interested from those other project management types that might be on the panel. What are some other ways that we could put some constraints or deadlines, time things on things that don't have a finite schedule? We don't have that crystal ball like we spoke about yesterday. Thank you.
Comments? Kelly?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I'm sorry I've got my back to you while we're talking, but because of the mic here. I just want to say that's something as a consultant that I've been tasked to do quite a few times. Look into this and tell us if there's a path forward that's interesting, and give us the options and the pros and cons that you can see right now. It is a really, really common strategy for scoping, and that's usually I assign a really small budget though. So not a bunch of people for a long period of time. It's usually, here, Kelly, you can have a week at most.
Aaron?
Yeah, I would strongly echo that. I think that's a good approach because I've been down a gazillion scientific rabbit holes that I could have avoided if we had that approach. So I agree. I've had that same approach with clients where they say, just, you have X amount of time, we want the top line, is this something we should pursue or should we not? I had a client ask me about bioplastics that sent me down a sizable rabbit hole that I'm still in. But they were continuing to ask the question, like, how is this relevant? The scope was relevant because they said, how is it relevant to our particular application? So that was helpful. But then it led me down some other interesting strategies. So yeah, I think what you've decided, like, take a first cut at it, give it a timeline, and see what we find. I think that's a good strategy.
Thank you. Helen?
Yeah, I agree. As much as I hate artificial deadlines, they do work. They're pretty effective. And actually, to add to that, though, I would say having a report out to someone is super important. Yeah, exactly right. So, yes, somebody who it matters if you, didn't finish it. So not just, your cube mate, but, somebody external to your org or somebody high enough in your org that if you showed up with nothing, they would be like, what is this, right? That's going to call you on that.
Go ahead, Shirley.
I just want to add on, but sometimes there is nothing. Mm-hmm. And that's actually why having a defined budget of you can have so many hours to play with something.
You have an answer.
Yeah, that's an answer. So but just to, I think one of the issues in the planning is that early phase. So I was kind of critical of how the department's getting to the ideas of the product chemical combinations, and maybe some more thought there about that. But I think this question goes to this kind of, how do we do some initial scoping before we decide to dive in on things? And I think that's something you probably already do, and we just didn't talk about that during this meeting, because you've already bared your souls in many ways to the group and the public. And to me, that's an amazing thing that the staff here have done. By the way, I just want to mention and thank the staff for doing that. As a former government staffer, I know how hard it is to do that and let everyone see the warts and still feel like they're going to trust the agency is competent. And my take on this is I trust the agency is more competent after that happens. So it's exciting. But just kind of back to the question at hand, that it's not a bad idea to think about that open-endedness a little bit, but putting a constraint of time instead of we're going to get a result.
Yeah, let me just comment as one of the first persons that those efforts come to, is that we don't just pull stuff out of thin air. Someone tells us, or we see something that says, oh, we should look at this. And oftentimes when we look, there's not much there. It doesn't mean there's not anything there, it's just we don't have access to it. But sometimes there's really nothing there. And to give you a concrete example, early on, one of the product chemical combinations that we were asked to look at from some folks were coal tar sealants.
Okay.
and that have certain hazardous characteristics of certainly legitimate concern. We took a quick look and we didn't find anything in California. But when that came up, it was like, well, wait a minute, no, there's something, because someone really credible said that there's something there. And so we spent a lot of time going down that rabbit hole until ultimately we had staff call around and ask all these, Granger and others, do you sell this product in California? What we found is it's not used in California. I mean, in the eastern United States, it's used very commonly. It's just not a product that we use here, which was a good outcome. But it took a lot of time and iterations, even when the first response was, there's nothing there. There was some disbelief. So there's always this challenge we have, which is someone thinks there's a problem here, and often it's not very well defined. So, we embrace that, but it's not always as simple as you might think.
And you have more comments.
So I think you kind of made my point for me, is that if you do that, if you put that time constraint on, be very clear about what your question is. So, my rabbit hole was constrained by the fact that my client wanted a question about a particular application for their product. So that's narrowed my scope. But yeah, if you are going to encounter times when you're not going to find anything out there. One of the other constraints is, let's be really clear about what my question is. And then I would then have someone to report out to, so that you can have that discussion about, is this worth pursuing? And like in your coal tar sealants, you had to dig a little deeper. So, I think that was a valid approach. But yeah, you're always going to have that tension. But I think the time constraint and being really clear about what question you're asking. Because mission creep is the other, challenge of a consultant.
Mike.
Yeah, just quickly, and a lot of what I want to say, obviously, as my card kept going up and down, was being said. But I just wanted to express with project management, a lot of times, and I'm sure you probably do this, but in running a project, you can have different phases. You start a project at an explore stage, an early explorer, and it's absolutely appropriate there to say, okay, we're going to work for 3 months and see what we find, and we're going to report back and look where there's interest. Mm-hmm. And then it bumps to Carl, and Carl might say, okay, yeah, I like that. No, I don't. Or guess what? You're not beyond explore yet because you didn't consider these, and you bounce back into that explore phase, and you get another 3 months to do the exact same thing. To be variable in your project and say these are the stages of the project. An explorer can go on as long as it needs to until we get to the right point, until we're going to jump that into the next phase where we're really building some meat into it. There's nothing wrong with that. I think it's a wise way to use your resources.
Thanks, Mike. Michael, are you getting?
I got everything I need. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. We have 5 more minutes. Kelly, you had a question?
My question was more about follow up on the AAT. And I guess I was just curious kind of what the panel thinks about how continuously would responsible entities need to report their levels to us? Is this just a one and done, like, okay, we've reported it? They might do internal testing, but do we need to get kind of continuous updated notifications from them to ensure that they're staying below those levels? Because we talked about, Helen's mentioned the variation, and I'm just curious about in terms of what we need to have from the manufacturers.
Tim?
I think there's some stuff in the regs about that in terms of right now, I think what the regs call for is what you might call like the fire alarm approach. Like if your product changes from what it was when you did this, then you got to let us know, and that's a continuing obligation, which is a pretty efficient way of doing it if you kind of have trust in the party, right? And that they're going to build in systems to be able to monitor that stuff. And I would suppose under the that you could expand that or change that. I like Carl's analogy to the hazardous waste stuff, which is where I started when I was doing enforcement. And I think one thing you might think about developing are kind of notions of what is a representative and maybe some triggers for when people have to go back and look again, right? And those could be narrative triggers, like when you change suppliers or when they're, like, I don't know what they would be, but technically speaking, it would be a good idea to kind of start thinking about what would be good triggers for having somebody go look again, as opposed to saying, having them retest every 6 months or whatever. So I think you could build in kind of management-based standards for kind of re-reporting and rechecking, and probably the hazardous waste regs are a really great, and the practices people do now in those areas are really, as Carl said, is a really good spot, because you've got the problem of variable streams, and then you also have this question of what's a representative sample, and you've got kind of the whole infrastructure about reporting, and like the hazardous waste determination rests, the burden is on the generator, right? And I think the same is true with the AAT. The burden is on this. So I think you could really model based on that, the experience that you have in those programs.
Thanks, Tim. Mike?
To me, it's an even more convoluted question. So if you developed an AAT for something that someone was intentionally adding, I would say they prepare their AA, they describe how they've gotten rid of it, and just like any other, there's not a continuous reporting back. In this case, unless you very specifically say that we're looking at 1,4-dioxane because of this raw material going into your product, I think because you're saying if you look at 1,4-dioxane as a contaminant, you're going to need to have some sort of mechanism where you're being assured that they're looking at all new potential sources of contamination. So I think because of the way you're structuring it as a contaminant instead of an intentionally added material, that you need to have then some feedback loop, and it can be a simple one, it doesn't need to be complex, but to make sure that they continue to look at other sources of that contaminant, even though they've potentially changed the original source where they found it from.
I want to follow up on this with a question. Does the department's data call-in authority, if it went the chemical analysis method route, would its data call-in authority allow it to require periodic submittal of test data once the method's developed?
I don't think.
We could periodically call it in. I don't know that we would. We don't do the call-in through a regulatory process. So I don't know that.
Yeah, I think that we could periodically ask using that authority, but that authority is relatively weak in terms of the compliance aspect. Is if someone doesn't respond, we put them on our list of non-responsive folks, but we could keep asking. But I don't think we would have to do a regulation, or in the AAT regulation specify a reporting standard, because otherwise anyone who enters the market in California for that listed product would be subject to the regulation. So that doesn't address an ongoing thing per se, but.
So you don't have an authority, like the water boards have an authority, section 13267, where they can issue a data requirement and then make the dischargers supply data. So you don't, your authority doesn't work the same as that.
It does not.
Okay. Thanks.
And is your comment related to Carl's?
Yeah, it's related to
Okay, then I'll go to Jennifer and let her be the last speaker before we take our break.
I like Tim's idea of management triggers. One of the ways the FDA does it is if you have a process change, you need to, but it's a very different structure, obviously. If you're submitting a drug product, there's a lot of other requirements. And so, but I'm worried about that being a management trigger here because the processes are so different, and I wouldn't want it to be burdensome on the manufacturer that if every time you change the supplier, you've got a different supplier of surfactant that you'd have to report in. That's burdensome both for DTSC and for the responsible entity. So I'm generally in support of this a management process trigger for reporting, but I just don't quite know how that would work.
Thank you. And Jennifer.
So my background is pharmaceutical, and I'm an analytical chemist, and so I'm trying to figure out, kind of in Michael's response to having the variability in the lots and the raw materials, you're going to have to do continuous testing on each of those or have some sort of certificate of analysis for each of your raw materials. And I wonder if this might be a chance to have the companies implement some sort of quality assurance to kind of verify their trending of lots and kind of the surfactants allowance of the 1,4-dioxane contaminant in each of those so that it could trend over time. You could look at different suppliers and then maybe utilizing the data call-in to kind of have those set checkpoints within SCP so that we can verify that, yes, this is going through. There's some quality assurance in the material that is being utilized. So, like, how could we use a trigger in parallel with kind of those assurances to keep that? I guess that's my question.
Let's see, at this point, we're going to end our discussion on AAT and take a break and return at 10:50. And as a reminder, in order to comply with the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act, we ask the panel members to refrain from discussing the agenda topics outside of the meeting. We'll reconvene at 10:50.
So this is reconvening the Green Ribbon Science Panel. Before we go on to the next item, I did want to do a check. Yesterday at the end of the day, I offered the opportunity to revisit any of the items from yesterday or anything else that panel members wanted to raise. And I wanted to see if there's anybody who would want to do that before the meeting ends. We don't have to do it right now. We can do it after this item. But I just wanted to do a check and see if anybody had some additional things they would like to raise. All right, that's a no. So with that, we'll move on to the Green Chemistry Research and Development Regulatory Response. And Carl Palmer is again on the hot seat that he's moving towards to introduce some of the considerations that need to be addressed in the context for the discussion the department's asking us to have to advise them on this matter.
Thank you, Kelly. I can talk really loudly. Thanks. The title of this slide is a little misleading because it's really about more of than just advancing green chemistry. But this item really is looking forward. We've talked a lot about how we've been doing the initial steps of the program, priority product selection, alternatives analysis, and that's been rich and valuable. And this is really sort of a thought piece to start this discussion because these are steps that are coming up that we haven't spent a lot of time on, but we want to sort of sow the seeds of thought for the GRASP because I anticipate that in our spring meeting next year, certainly if not the fall meeting, we'll be having a much richer, more detailed technical discussion on this item. But I wanted to sort of set the stage for that and give you a little bit of perspective on some of the things we're considering and some of the things we need to do. So briefly, as I highlighted yesterday in the steps of the program, the regulatory response phase is the final phase of the regulations after we evaluate the alternative analyses that are submitted by the regulated entities. And we have a variety of options of where we go from there. But it's important now because with the submittal of abridged AAs for the spray polyurethane foam with MDI products, is that we can see that on the horizon we will be facing this because it's a little unspecified in our regulations depending on how it goes with the spray polyurethane manufacturers and the quality of their abridged AA and the public comments and the subsequent steps. But it looks like that in next year sometime we'll be dealing with this issue in terms of where to, in terms of the department's decisions on regulatory responses. And so that specifically our regulations require that at a minimum that when we process an abridged AA that we deal with 2 of the 7 regulatory responses that are outlined in the regulations. And those are requiring that the responsible entities provide information to consumers about their product with the assumption that they can provide more information about the potential risk of using that product and appropriate measures to, as a user, to protect oneself. And the other one is this advancement of green chemistry bucket. And we're going to dive into that a little bit in more detail. But I wanted to, before we do that, I wanted to highlight that, importantly, in our regulations, the provisions, the guidance that we put on ourselves, the requirement, is that we give preference to regulatory responses that provide the greatest level of inherent protection. And this is important for a couple of reasons. One, as you've heard us talk for quite a while, is that we tried to avoid criteria in our regulations that told us to do the most important thing or focus on the worst actor or, avoid the STs, as we would say. But in this case, we do have a requirement to look at those regulatory responses that really do provide the greatest level of protection that we can identify. So I wanted to highlight that. But I also wanted to highlight that that's tempered somewhat in a pragmatic fashion, in that we did put in the regulations that when we make a determination of a regulatory response, that we not only consider the public health and the environmental protection aspects, as I highlighted, and doing what's best for people in the environment, but that we also consider the real economic interests of the responsible entities. There are limits, practical and effective limits that need to be considered when we say, well, if you're going to do a green chemistry grant challenge, what does that look like? And recognizing that we'll have a variety of people that are subject to this. They may be a small business, they may be a huge corporation, that their resources are limited and their abilities are limited, so we need to take that into account. Also, we also need to take into account that this is not meant to be something that creates a huge burden on government to manage and create and monitor all these regulatory responses that come at a cost. So there's really an element built into our regulations of what's meaningful and practical here. So that's really important. But that's the limit of the specifics in the regulations. So it gives us, again, a lot of discretion about what does that look like. And of course, the devil's going to be in the details, depending on the specific product we're looking at and the specific companies we're dealing with. But we need to start thinking about how we're going to go about making those evaluations and determinations. So briefly, to look at the menu, if you will, of regulatory responses that we identify in our regulations, as I just highlighted, we have, I think, 7 or 6. The product information to consumers and the last bullet on this slide, the advancement of green chemistry, are 2 that are required for someone who submits an abridged AA. That said, those are just the minimum standards. We still have the latitude that the department can look at the other regulatory response options and, if appropriate, impose those as well. And those include things like actual requiring safety measures or administrative controls be put in place for that product or its sale, and end-of-life management requirements, if appropriate. So if, for example, a product at its end of life is a hazardous waste and creates a burden on local government, because what are we going to do with it, that we, for example, could require that the responsible entity or a group of them implement some kind of product stewardship program, much like we have for carpets and rugs and paint in California, so that there would be a mechanism to safely manage that waste at its end of life. And then ultimately, if necessary and appropriate, we can restrict the sale of that product or ban the sale of that product in California. So that's sort of our menu of options very broadly. And again, we don't provide a lot of detail on what specifically those things would look like, although we do put in our regulations some criteria which address what this green chemistry advancement concept looks like. And so, again, depending on the type of product and the alternatives that were evaluated and the potential for filling data gaps or looking at issues that would relate to how you might improve performance or safety of a product, or how, if in fact there's some alternatives design that are out there, but they're incredibly cost prohibitive. We have a range of things that we can consider in implementing the regulatory response. And what I wanted to do in part was, because we are required for the abridged AAs to look at the information providing to consumers, which ostensibly should be a relatively easy activity once we, again, based on the specifics of the product, but more challenging in some senses, this concept of a green chemistry challenge. And so what I wanted to do was really focus in and say to you, the panel, some basic questions, which are really, how might we do this? And I think there are examples out there in other contexts that are hopefully informative, and maybe we can take parts of those processes. You know, a lot of folks have grant programs. There are research and development challenges and projects, both voluntary. I point to GC3's efforts on looking at preservatives, which was a really fascinating and I think productive process. So part of what I'm hoping today is to stimulate some conversation about where might we at this point be looking to say, well, first, what are the types of realistically goals we would want to achieve in a green chemistry challenge grant, for example? And then how might we approach figuring out how best to do that, given the broad range of potential responsible entities, given the broad nature of the challenge, things like how much money is needed to do something like that. The department doesn't have a lot of experience in manufacturing or designing products, and we're learning a lot, but again, we don't have much insight into how much time, energy, money, expertise does it take to address some of these design challenges. Some of the panel members have a lot of experience on that. So it's really more of a question process right now. What are the things we need to consider? Are there models out there that we could learn from, that we could explore to say, you know, how are those things set up and defined and measured? And so it's pretty open-ended at this point. Again, looking forward, as in much of the regulations, the great thing is that we have opportunity for doing some very creative things and a wide range of decisions. The challenge is that we have a great opportunity of a wide range of decisions at the same time. So with that, I'll just kind of leave it open-ended, and we can start addressing some of these questions or thoughts that you have, unless you have any clarifying questions.
Thank you, Carl, and now's the time for informational and clarifying questions, and Elaine's first, then Ann. Oh.
Okay, so probably I just missed this. Who you in your response, you have the regulated entities put forward the investment and then you implement the grant? Is that how it works, or?
No, it's really not specifically defined in terms of how we would divide and craft that regulatory response.
Okay.
The expectation is that it's the responsibility of the responsible entity. So whatever role of the manufacturer typically. So and just to give you a little bit of practical how this might work, is that we don't anticipate doing a regulation that would implement this. This would be a negotiated consent agreement, or if necessary, an order on our part to each responsible party. It could be a collective effort. We have a lot of latitude on what that would look like. But the AAs that are going to come in the bridge are going to say, well, here's some things we think we should do. I think the draft AA, Tony, correct me if I'm wrong, for the spray foam folks leaves it very open-ended as what they think those regulatory responses might be. But we would enter a dialogue with all of those folks and say, okay, what are your thoughts about what works? And we would give ours, and we would then go through a process of making some decisions and then implementing those for each regulated entity. But it's not, theoretically, it could be something that we do some work on, but primarily we'd be looking to those people to fund and implement those regulatory responses.
Tim?
I have a clarifying question about what you just said.
Yeah.
So I read through their the AA that they submitted. I mean, they basically say we'll talk about it.
Right.
And, within 12 months, they'll agree to something. Okay. So there's a deadline.
Well, just note that's the deadline they say they.
That's their, but they say.
Yeah.
Right. But I was struck by what you said, where you said, well, this would be regulation. We, enter negotiations and do an order. So do you anticipate in that process that there'd be an opportunity for public input on that?
Yes,
Because
and it is required, actually, the AA process allows for that and is required as we develop regulatory responses, that this will be a public process for a good chunk of it. It's not going to be done in the back room. It'll be a public process. So, yeah, it's built into the regulations.
Okay, thank you.
It's always nice to have an attorney.
Well, no, it's just, particularly when you have something like this where they don't, I mean, one could argue that this is incomplete because it says in here you're supposed to propose something, and they've proposing something.
Well, and I just want to point out that, we're in the process of evaluating what they submitted.
I get it.
Yeah, we don't want to predetermine or make any determination at this point, but that's going to be an ongoing discussion.
Before I go to Elaine, just as a reminder, I'm actually, maybe I should just leap in here and say this, that we should note that the idea that the staff are hoping is that this would be a short discussion and intended to provide them guidance as they begin to develop the concepts around the regulatory response. That's kind of what Carl was saying earlier. And the goal is to provide ideas for key resources, approaches, models that the staff will follow up on, and they're expecting that we'll be revisiting this at a future meeting. Importantly, this topic is broadly about developing this kind of regulatory response. So even though we have in our minds this particular one, they're really seeking guidance overall. And it's not about us advising the department as to what to do for this particular one. And the details thereof, although it provides an illustrative example, they're really looking to us and saying how this is going to come up again and again. How do we approach and structure that? So I just want to keep that in mind, because I think it's really important that we not focus on the specific example here or get too weedy in that, because that is a subject of ongoing regulatory discussion that isn't what we advise on. Okay.
Thanks for that clarification.
Yeah, I guess I just still don't understand the parameters of this kind of response. So what the intent is, right? So the intent is that the regulated entity would somehow fund something, but it's not necessarily funding their own R&D per se. It's funding something that would impact more broadly who they put up the fund. Theoretically, what's the intent? That they would put up the funding, and who would benefit from the funding?
Carl, before you answer that, can you just put that you had the descriptor from the regulations on an earlier slide?
Yeah, I did.
Sorry.
Which one?
That one?
Yeah, that one. That would help, because I think people didn't get to look at that long enough. It was in our packet.
Well, I know, I don't understand
But it
it.
was sparse.
I guess what I'm asking is, what does that mean? That's
Okay,
my
sure.
question.
So from a very practical standpoint, I think, let's say a hypothetical is that an AA comes in and they've said, well, we've looked at all that, there's no alternative, or we think there might be an alternative, but the data gaps are huge, we couldn't get that information, more work needs to be done. Just like reading a scientific paper where they typically say, they kind of hedge on what the conclusion is, like more studies.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but specifically, we would be looking at that and say, well, what actually needs to be done to fill that data gap, perhaps, or to look at one of the challenges in manufacturing, or to answer some of the questions that are raised in the AA process. And we might very specifically say, well, we want you to look at the supply chain and how what chemicals are out there that might be alternatives, but you didn't look at in the AA, or filling some technical gap that in the research, in the literature, identified but not filled. So it's very open-ended, and it's going to be very specific to whatever product we're talking about. And I think to your point about, is it going to benefit the person who is regulated or the broader community of I think the general intent for the green chemistry perspective is to inform that sector about green chemistry options that could be looked at for alternatives. Advancing, if you will, the science and the engineering and practical nature of how manufacturers could design safer products. That's the general intent. What that looks like, we have a lot of latitude in what that could be. Does that answer your question, Elaine?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, maybe as the conversation goes on, I'll back up. It sort of does.
I think, I used the GC3 example of, and Mike could probably speak to it more specifically. If there are these challenges in different sectors that are well known that people have been working on, and sometimes innovation happens and sometimes things stall. Maybe it's something that's stalled because there hasn't been enough resources allocated to one aspect that could further that discussion. And I think it's important to note that there is not inherently an expectation that there will be a silver bullet or solution that comes out of this, but it might just be about advancing towards safening the supply chain process.
Are there any other informational and clarifying questions? Right, let's move on to discussion. So this is a kind of meaty topic, and Helen, why don't you start?
Some thoughts on different ways that you could approach it. I mean, you probably already have some of this, but I'm just going to kind of tick off some of them. Obviously, there's academic funding. There's obviously the grant processes that you mentioned. I do want to just kind of put a footnote on that, though, is that grants can be really tough from the application side, especially for small businesses and small groups. The grants process is very hard in California, and I don't know compared to other places. It's just, it's a lot of information. It's difficult for a startup, for example, to comply. And even if a smaller company does it, they may not have the ability to do some of the AA. If there's AA type work to prove that their thing is better, they may not have the skills. So not to say not to do that, but I just want to put a footnote on the grant side of things. Obviously, there's consultancies. That's sort of an obvious group that needs to be considered as sort of, you pay a high-end, a highly skilled, I should say, consultancy to look at a particular problem. There's consortia and trade groups, like the GC3 kind of approach. And then the one that probably needs a little bit of thought but might make some sense would be, is there some sort of accelerator sort of format that maybe one of the green chemistry focused accelerators could be a vehicle for this injection. So a lab accelerator would normally have shared lab space that is made available to different startups, for example, and it would normally come with funding from a venture VC of some type. But you get a small amount of funding, and then you have free access to some lab space and office space. So that's like an accelerator type model. And what might come with that would be access to the technical experts to help answer some of those AA-related questions that the startup might not have in-house, for example. Again, similar for an accelerator, a technical accelerator, where they would bring in, they give you access to law, startup legal expertise to help you get your corporation set up and all these different things like that. So part of the value in a startup accelerator is that it's not just the funding you get, you actually get all this constellation of services that kind of go with it. And that might be something that you could, if you built the capacity to inject into a system like that, as you had more, if you anticipated having multiple of these, then you might want to have one of those green chemistry focused groups kind of have that, facilitate that as an option for you, and then you could open it up to however many groups, startups or other small groups might want to participate in something like that. You can get your $100,000 of funding if you go through our accelerator program on this topic, for example. So there's definitely some models on that. There's pros and cons to all of that, but that's how people tackle other types of technical questions, not just green chemistry in particular.
Thank you. So, accelerator models, Anne and then Elaine.
So it's probably safe to say that I've been waiting for this moment for years. And this is the part of the regs that we have not thought a lot about, and it's really exciting, and the potential of what DTSC could do to move the market on green chemistry and increase market penetration. I've spent a lot of time doing research, trying to figure out what keeps safer alternatives from getting on the market, and we can go into that in more detail. So those are some of the things I can offer. There's a report we did for GC3 and also for the Cancer-Free Economy Network about what the market barriers are and how to overcome them. So I wanted to have some comments about what has worked in the models that you've mentioned and other ones that you haven't potentially mentioned. I also wanted to echo what Helen said about accelerators. There's a lot of accelerators out there. We could partner with them and say we have this specific problem that came out of our current profile and or AA process and have them focus with us on that. So let me start with those. So the things that have worked, Mike will probably talk more about the GC3 preservatives challenge, but I know it from sort of the opposite end because one of the Greener Solutions, Berkeley Center for Green Chemistry Greener Solutions projects came in and was a winner in the GC3 preservatives. What I understood about that is there was a pain point across the entire sector, and so that really drove the collaboration, that this is a common problem that we all shared. We all need, the chemistry on preservatives was limited, and so it was to the benefit of the entire sector to move forward on looking for safer alternatives. The innocentive piece was another interesting part, I think, because it got kind of out of the woodwork some alternative chemistries that people haven't thought about. And then also the key success factor, I think, for the GC3 preservatives challenge was Homer Sway at J&J. There was an internal champion in the sector who got his colleagues from other companies, from competitors, on board, because this was an unusual model. Would you say that's true? Yeah. So along those lines, through the Greener Solutions classes, we've seen also what has worked is that, once again, it's like I said earlier, it's defining the question narrowly enough from a chemical point of view, from a functional point of view, to get the widest range of alternatives. But it's, again, also the industry partner has come in with some kind of pain point and a serious problem. We've dealt with a whole array of solutions, everything from stereolithography resins, about which I know absolutely nothing, the preservatives piece, textile treatments, plastics, biodegradable plastics. I mean, it's a whole array of potential problems. So I think I'm sorry that Meg has stepped down just at this point from this committee, because she could tell you much more about the Greener Solutions model. And in fact, she's just published a paper. She and Heather Buckley have just published a paper about this Greener Solutions model. But I think that's one, it's in our backyard. We should take advantage of it. And I think there are other resources within the UC system that we could to tap into. And then on a slightly different topic, I think it's this last piece that I hadn't read in detail in the regulation before, this idea of one of the regulatory responses would be to have the responsible entity increase market penetration of a safer alternative. Because it had come to my attention that there was a small company that had a bio-based, really effective alternative to methylene chloride stripper, but because they weren't an existing manufacturer, it didn't go through the AA process. And they have not made it into the market, although it's a very clear and safer alternative. And I'm kind of struggling with how do we change, what's that flaw in our regulation that didn't anticipate that kind of response to what we put out there in terms of challenge, but this safer alternative has not made it onto the market. Is there somewhere in the regulatory response that we could think about what's out there and why are they not making it to market? So I think it's, or is that even in the purview of DTSC's regulations to think about what the barriers to the market are? Anyway, I'd be happy to think more about that because obviously I've spent some time digging into that. So I think that's it for the moment.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. Those are really good points about the Berkeley program and how the market fits into this. Yeah, because it's suppliers with alternatives and also supply chain availability are really big, huge issues. So I've got Elaine, Tim, and Helen.
So I guess I was, you had put in here the example of the SBIRs. And, I guess the advantage is you put out a topic and you go broad, right? And it's two-staged. So someone gets a little bit of money to do something exploratory, and then they get a little more if they've proven there's something there, right? But I think I think something like that is potentially beneficial model in the context of something like an accelerator because, I think that's where you're going to have things generated and then they sort of don't go anywhere, right? And if what you're really wanting to do is move, I think you're going to have to. I think there are elements of models that you may want to look at and take advantage of, and then where those things sort of lose traction, the accelerator idea to me is really powerful, especially if you've. I guess what I'm not understanding in particular about the regulation and the goals is again how you're, is this the regulated entity just getting some time and a mandate to spend their own money to develop their own intellectual property, or is this trying to more broadly stimulate these kinds of technologies and advancements? And if it's the latter, being able to sort of cast a broad net and get really interesting little ideas that you wouldn't get, but then having really the support to take something where there's a there forward is going to be really important.
Just to respond to that, I think that the answer to that is yes on all of those, potentially, because it's not well defined in the regulations, but certainly back to Ann's point about market penetration, I think part of the calculus will be what is going to be meaningful and effective. So part of that is how would it work in the market, whether it's someone develops their own IP and they can use it to their benefit as well as the broader sector, or is it something that'll be in the public domain that will stimulate the market? I think all of those are on the table within our authority. And then so when you look at the factors that we consider, I like this concept of cobbling together something that holistically can work, and it might be aspects of a lot of these different models. So.
Yeah, I mean, one of the themes so far is this concern about the market actually taking it up. So, Helen, are you? Let's see. I've got Tim actually next. Do somebody want to pick up on that before we go on to the next topic? Or
one of the things that might be worth considering is that there's grant money not just for the science of it. There's actually marketing money because most startups and small companies have zero budget for that, right. and zero know-how, and so help and support for go-to-market, both marketing, but also developing your distribution channel, making the right introductions to the right people at the right companies. There's actually quite a lot to getting something to, not even to market, but to almost be considered for market, right? And so there might be some things, and they might not actually cost a lot. It's just that connection or that introduction might be something as well.
Are you going to build on that, or should we let Tim, who's been patient? Go ahead.
No worries. Oh, while you're debating, can I just chime in on that note just a little bit to give you some insight? Is that over the years, as we start rolling out work plans and talk about products, we have a variety of companies that come to us who say they have built a better mousetrap, and some of them, we don't know if it's. But I think it's clear that some of them don't have some of those tools that help just mentioned. And so that I think within the scope of the intent, all that is potentially something we could look at as a way to, daylight those and support that in the broader market.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of times they don't even know what questions to ask. They don't know who to talk to. Mm-hmm. Like there's standard qualification tests for certain types of things, and they may not even know what those are. Right. So there's a huge value to it. Again, it may not cost any dollars to do it.
So I'm going to let Mike finish up this topic and then go to Tim, who's being extremely patient.
I just want to build on what Helen was saying a bit, in that it's not even just this, because I think the small companies that have developed something, they're stuck with how they promote it. But even big companies, it takes a long time to develop green chemistry, something better. I mean, we've done it. But then with larger companies, give 5 years at least before you can get on the market with something from your initial concept. But even then, it's how do you promote that product? There's not a lot of labeling you can do and say, okay, well, we've made a greener product and attract consumer, because you're looking pretty much at a parity product, and it's going to hopefully cost the same, maybe a little more. But how do you recover that investment? Doesn't stop us from doing it. It's what industry needs to do. But in the perspective of an RR, you're too late in the scheme to say, okay, if you're going to say in your RR, yeah, develop greener chemistry, if there's not something already there, do you really want to give someone 5 years to develop greener chemistry that doesn't exist yet, and be able to get it out on the market? So my thinking is you've got to be earlier, and hit that marketing for the smaller companies that have developed something and it really exists out there, and hit it early on versus the RR. I'm struggling to find where you put it in the RR to do that development.
So I think we've hit this pretty well. So Tim, why don't you go ahead? Thank you.
Thank you for saying I'm patient. I didn't really have much choice, but I'll take it. So I had a couple thoughts about this. One is like thinking about other models. So a lot of people talked about really good models to think about. The other you might think about is AQMD has their Office of Technology Advancement, and they've done stuff where like they know they've got regulatory stuff they're going to have to deal with, and then they fund people who are doing projects that will put them in a position to advance that. They seem to be really good at it. They did a really nice job of it with respect to the phase out of perchloroethylene in dry cleaning, where they basically laid the groundwork for that and then issued a rule that phased out perchloroethylene, right? So there's a little bit of a parallel here, and that's a well-developed program. So it might make sense to kind of take a look at that. That's one thing I'd suggest. Then I got thinking about the purpose of this particular regulatory response, and I have to agree with Ann. It's like I've been waiting for like 11 years for this conversation, in the sense of, I think, we think about the AA part as being like the really revolutionary advancement. And in a sense, I think this is the most radical revolutionary thing in the statute, because, you're essentially saying, as a regulatory response, you're going to make people pay money to develop, to advance, right? That's revolutionary. And I think the important part there is the intent here was to make people pay money, right? And so I'll say a couple things about that. I think you could think about these abridged AAs as being of two types, like in my mind. One is what I might call an apologetic abridged AA. That is, they really wanted to find a safer alternative, but try as they may, it's just not there, but they wish it was there, and they're really incentivized to like try and find one, right? So these are people who are proactive and they want to work with you to figure this out. And then there's what you might call the strategic abridged AA, where they're pretty happy there wasn't a safer alternative, and they were being really strategic about how they define alternatives and all that. So those are people that might have to get dragged along, right? And I think with respect to this thing, you might think about those differences, and you might address those categories of industries differently. There's some interesting stuff in the statement of reasons for the reg where, and it was so interesting, I'll just read it. It talks about the provision. It says, this provision is necessary to compel responsible entities to invest in research and development in safer alternatives to the priority product, right? I think that's important. That's like, it feels strange to say you're going to tell people to spend money. That's not what you normally do. But that's what this is all about. So I'd be careful about like trying to think about it in ways that, in which you try to avoid making people spend money. Because, typically we think, oh, let's not make people spend money. But this is supposed to make people spend money. In fact, it's interesting. It goes on and it says, the commitment of time and resources that this will entail is anticipated to deter responsible entities who might be inclined to claim without adequate basis that an acceptable alternative is not readily available, just to avoid conducting the second stage A. That's my strategic abridged, right? So in a sense, what you do here is supposed to, I think, have a deterrent value. So if you are too accommodating as you go along, here we go, it's going to signal to people not much consequence for the abridged AA. So I think there's lots of good reasons to be robust in your implementation of this. So that leads to my next comment, which is, okay, so your question about financially how you determine the appropriate parameters. So I think there's a couple things you might think about. One clearly would be capacity of the industry, like how much money, like you don't really want to, and you pointed out, Carl, about like having to take that into account in your things. But the other thing is, if the idea here is you want to deter people from kind of skirting the AA requirements, it might be useful if you're looking for benchmarks to think about if there had been alternatives, in general, what would an AA have cost? And that might be a good starting point for thinking, here's how much we want people to invest, in the sense that they're avoiding doing the AA because of this. Other people for whom there are alternatives have to do an AA. Maybe we should start thinking about, here's a chunk of money that they otherwise would have been spending to comply. Maybe you adjust that up or down depending on other factors, but at least it gives you some kind of starting basis to think about. And maybe that would scale to the kind of projects that you have, right? Okay. Two last points and I'll stop. One is, I think it would be a good idea, and maybe you're already doing this, to have a proactive list of kind of shovel-ready projects in each of your areas that you're thinking about, right?
Yep.
So you're doing a lot of work up front thinking about alternatives. People are coming to you saying, I got a great alternative. So it might be like, when I was at EPA, we used to do the supplemental enforcement projects in the penalty areas. That was easier because if they didn't do it, they were going to be paying things. So, you know, that doesn't fit here. But we did used to have like a set of projects that when we negotiated with people, here's a set of projects that might be helpful. That might be a good idea if you can do that, to have kind of this list of things, and then it makes it, you can be a little more strategic about the funding. Like you had said, Carl, there's like different places we'd like to look. Well, maybe if you've got multiple responsible entities, you can be a little strategic about where you get funded. And then the last, there's two last points. The next last point is, I think it's a great idea to try and leverage this with other resources. So maybe there's ways where if you're working with somebody and they're going to invest in this challenge or the research, that you look for ways where there's other funding that will match what they're doing. Like think about multiplying the impact of this by seeing if you can get like, so the SBIR program I think has, I'm not sure, I know there's grant programs out there where you get money from the government if you show you're putting so much in. So maybe this would be an opportunity to think about taking advantage of those things. And last thing, I would encourage you, like Carl, you said something in general, you said, well, you know, maybe we would use this to get people to fill data gaps or things like that. I would encourage you that if you have like, you have a situation where the person says there's no alternatives, but they've also said we have data gaps about, you know, hazard or this or that you use other your regulatory response to require people to go in and fill data gaps. You have that other one. I'd encourage you to kind of like try to use that as much as you can for data gaps, and not, I mean, because that's something where people have to do that. So if you use this for that, you're essentially not making people pay to do something. You know what I mean? I mean, they should be doing, as my wife likes to say, when I do something good and I brag to my wife, she says, I wouldn't have married you if you didn't do stuff like that. So you don't get credit for doing what you should be doing, right? So that's what I mean. Like if you use this to get them to fill in data gaps that you otherwise could have required them to fill in, they're getting credit for something they should otherwise be doing, and you're losing a little bit of the power, I think, of this program. But I'm like, I can't tell you how. I think this is just a terrific thing, and I love that you are thinking about how to use this to maximum benefit and creativity. I think it's like just very admirable.
Right. Thank you. That was a huge slew of really big points. So Art, and then I'm going to slip in before going to Mike.
Yeah, I just want to go back to one point that Ann Blake made that I think is really important, and that's related to the GC3 Preservative Challenge and the importance of having an advocate or champion to really drive the entire project. And that's definitely the case for other green chemistry collaborative innovations that I've been involved in. Having a champion, so a champion on both the company level and on the individual level is really important, because on the company level, if you have a company like H&M, IKEA, or Apple being interested, it just generates interest and it pulls in other companies in that same sector or industry. And having an individual champion is really important because otherwise nothing gets done. That's just the way it is. So just again, want to emphasize the point that Ann made.
And I actually want to build on that. So I like the SBIR example has a lot of good stuff in it. I'm not so fond of the Green Chemistry Challenge because of my fear that all of those pieces don't come together there. Another example that I'm familiar with that's a little different outcome is Department of Pesticide Regulation has this thing called the IPM Alliance Program, so Integrated Pest Management. And what that is a two-phased grant program that requires you to build a group of people who are wanting the solution to, in this case, the pest problem with a greener solution. And the first phase, if you don't have that group of folks that's got all the right kinds of stakeholders and particularly folks who would be implementing it, you don't get the money. And that means that creates a market right away for the solution. So it's folks who want to solve X problem with X pest without Y nasty pesticide. And it's a two-step grant program, so it's one to take a kind of a look at. The thing that I think makes it work and the thing that I'm particularly wanting to highlight in the light of all of these things is the requirement that there be a group or a team that involves not just the either one or a group of manufacturers, but customers, folks who are in the supply chain, other folks who might be part of that group. And therefore, it solves some of these market problems that we've been hearing about on all these other things. That's the thing that the IPM Alliance program does pretty well. And that one also has a really interesting thing, which is that they spend the first time kind of trying to look for the solutions. And if they don't find something, they don't go on to the larger grant in the second stage. So sometimes that means that you might have to do several rounds of stage one before you get to stage two. And the department should recognize that might happen. So that kind of goes to a bigger theme for me, is that it seems to me that this process needs to be multi-step in nature, and that there need to be timelines, milestones, really revisiting it, a lot of oversight. There needs to be literature work, computational work, in vitro work, whatever. There needs to be steps to the process before you get all the way to, we'll just send somebody out and they'll make something really cool and everyone will use it. Well, that's kind of fiction. So peer review and external experts probably need to be part of that as well. So that's another feature that often occurs in the IPM Alliance program. And there, your external experts might be resources to some extent, the accelerator model, but just the idea that there's something there. I've got some cautions like Tim does. The first is that Department of Pesticide Regulation has a lot of experience requiring industries to develop new things. So they have an authority called reevaluation that allows them to issue requirements for special studies. They call them data requirements, but they can be all kinds of special studies. And in my experience, this requirement is a bust. And so
I'm sorry, it's a what?
It's a bust. It doesn't. In fact, they've virtually eliminated using this authority because of the problems they've experienced. And these include multi-year fights just on the scopes. So they spend years literally arguing about what the scope of the project will be. So they come to an agreement, they're going to do something, and they set a schedule, but then there's all these points where Department of Pesticide Regulation needs to approve this or that, and then the industry argues with them about it, or they send them a really, really obviously crummy, not thought out document just to delay moving forward with it. The study designs are often problematic, so they're not designed to actually properly have enough QA/QC or replicates or whatever. There's issues with the study design, so you don't actually get the information that you need. So you get negative results. And so a fear here is that the whole thing could be designed to fail. And you don't want to embark on something where the department really has to be the driver for success and the industry isn't motivated for success. So we're all kind of approaching this conversation as if the industry wants to find an alternative. And if the goal here is more strategic, as Tim is talking about, you might encounter an industry that really just wants to defend its chemical. Then you wind up with a really different problem because you can't make them want something they don't want. But you can in a couple ways. One is really thinking about how do you make a no answer a negative. And to some extent, the regulations do that a little bit by requiring you at least require disclosure. But if it just continues to be a buyout to continue to pollute, as it were, that's it. So the folks have to spend, $10 or $50 or $100,000 a year. That's basically paying to pollute. That was not the intent of the regulations, and so it's really important that things be designed so that there's a negative at the other end for lack of success. So one of those is always the threat of getting rid of the product, but where it's a product that there are other reasons the California market wants something in that place, then the state's not going to be very eager to do that. Another is to look at some sort of escalating investment requirement in investing in the alternatives. So Tim mentioned as a benchmark that the avoided cost of the phase 2 AA. I'm actually thinking that the department should be thinking bigger than that and thinking about maybe there should be some benchmark percent of retail sales. So like when you register a pesticide, you pay an annual fee that's based on the total sales of that product in terms of dollars. So something like that. And you don't want to make it so big that it eliminates profits, because that's the same as banning it. But it would not be unreasonable to basically require a part of the profits of the folks in this area be invested in the research and the alternatives. So that creates a disincentive. They want their profits back. So those are pretty nasty things, but it's something, structuring this is going to be really important, so it's not just a pay to pollute. And so that that there really is a path forward that moves down the chain to safer products. All right. Mike, Tim, after that.
Okay, so I'm going, not my state the obvious, but just swipe things that other people have said, trend that I've got going this week. And because when Tim was talking, it struck me, and he was talking about, having some green chemistry initiatives that were already kind of seeded out there and building on those. And then Kelly was talking about, there are various phases to when you're doing that. You've got your initial scoping. And I was just kind of, and I wasn't sure if this is where Tim was going or not. But, if there is a priority product that the agency thinks, this is going to be one where we're expecting to get a lot of these abbreviated A's coming back in that are compliant, is it a good idea if potentially the agency could seed some of that early, can fund some of that early exploratory work to say, is there some green chemistry that would substitute for this? Not pay the big bucks of developing it, but is it a potential? Seed that, and then when someone comes in with their abridged AA, it's not the agency who has got a limited time to respond saying, oh, gee, could it be done? But it's, oh, we already thought about that, and put in the RR that we know there is this potential green chemistry path that could get you a solution. So your option is to go off the market, whatever, or this study's been seeded. If you want to join in and start to fund this, and whoever else has done this can jump in as well. And by the way, to get in, you got to repay us our seed money. It might give just a leg up, because what I'm concerned with is a lot, as I said earlier, a lot of these initiatives, they take so long. But if it's seeded of this is a possibility, you cut that response time down. And if I recall correctly, the regulatory responses are not confidential. So you've already put kind of a big pressure on these players to say, oh yeah, you guys did a great job on your abbreviated AA. We love it. Here's your options. It's not like they can hide it. It's going to be very public that they've got this ability to work forward, and you've done some pre-work for them. I think it just might move things along quicker. And I'm hoping it wouldn't take the agency a lot of time, because I think it's stuff that you've thought about already. You're developing these, and it's like, we can't see an alternative there. But you're not saying there can't be. But it's possible that it could become net zero, just investing money up front with the agency, but then hopefully getting it back later as a possibility.
All right, thank you for stating the obvious, but also coming up with another thing to think about. I've got Tim and Elaine, and we're heading towards wrapping up. You and then Elaine.
I didn't know if you wanted me to be patient.
I appreciate it.
Okay, so Mike, that's exactly what I was thinking of, and that's why I mentioned the OTA example, which I think you kind of picked up on in there, where they're Office Technology Advancement. They're thinking ahead in the way you're talking about. They're seeding some projects. They don't have this ability to require responsible entities to then pay in to advance what's happened before. And I'm thinking about the OTA model as being you being an enhancement of that, right? You're coming at the other end of where OTA is paying up front. You're taking it further and saying, hey, why don't you seed some things, get those shovel-ready things together, and then you can do it. That's an interesting twist. I like this idea. Can you get the seed money back? Because if you could characterize what you've done as part of a challenge, then you can get them to fund the challenge both prior and moving forward. Very creative kind of thing. So I would encourage you to be as creative and dynamic in those ways, because if you think about it, like DTSC, I think, likes to talk about this program as working with industry to advance green chemistry, right? So this is the opportunity to do that. You are, in a sense, an Office of Technology Advancement as well. I mean, that's what you're trying to do. I wanted to respond to one thing Kelly said, which is I agree with you about the foot draggers and all those. And you mentioned a couple of good strategies for preventing them capturing the system. I mean, the other strategy, I guess this is stating the obvious, is in the regs where it's like, you might be more inclined to use the, hey, responsible entity, fund a challenge or fund a grant as opposed to you go do the research. Because the other way to cut them out of being able to slow things down is you define what you want done and they just pay for it, and then you have control over when it happens and all. And so it may be that that's a category of things when you sense you're dealing with a strategic rather than an apologetic AA, you use grant funding as opposed to having them invest in things and vice versa.
All right. Elaine?
Yeah, so this is just a quick little follow-up on the seeding things or whatever, but when you look at the SBIRs and the list of solicitation topics, so safer chemicals, I know exactly how those ideas get in there, so if you just call Jeff Fritzen up and just tell him which things you need.
I like that concrete.
Just saying. Okay. Well, or you call me and I'll call him, whatever.
Okay, so any last words from the panel? So now I want to turn to staff. Do you guys have any questions of the panel? We didn't cover everything that you asked, or is there anything you'd like to follow up on?
Yeah, I don't know how to use this, but yeah, I have one question.
Introduce yourself, sorry.
In terms of,
is the button on?
Should be great.
Oh, there you go. That's right.
Okay.
It's red. It's red.
Okay. Yeah. Tony, go ahead.
Oh, okay. No, you guys talked about the green chemistry challenges and the green chemistry efforts, and Art, you talked about how Apple has developed a PVC-free coating for wires and how you didn't take a patent on it, and you sort of put it out there for everybody to use. But I was wondering about the ownership of these safer processes that we're going to receive the money for additional technology development, and we actually do find a safer process. Is it necessarily the better way to go that the ownership is given to the industry that's working on it, or is there a better benefit to maintain ownership or to distribute it so there is no patent on it, so it's freely available to everybody? I mean, the regulations seem to imply that to improve the performance or decrease the cost or increase market penetration, that the ownership would go to the responsible entities. But in some of these challenges, are there other alternatives where the development goes to the public domain? I'm sorry, it's a convoluted question.
Clear. Yeah. So anybody have any thoughts about that? Sort of I know that SBIR and the cooperative reason there's some agreements for that in advance in like the CRADA process. Just wondering if anybody has any reactions to that who might own things, or is that really something that has to be thought out on a case-by-case basis? Okay, Ann says that's a longer discussion for next time. Okay.
But one thing is that let's say if I were funding or driving the effort. And if I know I'm going to own the patent or the intellectual property afterwards, isn't that an incentive for me to be more, more proactive or drive it a little bit harder?
Yeah. So that sounds like something that's a big question, and that probably a little more thought ought to be given to, so that we could come back to that kind of stuff.
Thank you.
So, thanks.
All right. Carl, anything else from staff before we move to? Okay. Why don't we move to closing out the meeting? I think,
Yes, I'm going to.
You get to go first, and then
Sure.
Art and I get to go, unless
Yes.
it's the other way around.
That's
Okay.
great. Thank you, Kelly. Well, first of all, I want to echo what Meredith said this morning, and thanks to our staff. There's a lot of work to bring these events together, and as usual, they do an outstanding job, and I'm very appreciative of that hard work, and it's very fruitful. And I want to thank the panel. I think, we spent a lot of time thinking about the retrospective aspect of the program, and as Andre laid out in both in the narrative that we provided and in the discussion we had, the program is at a point where we've been trying to build this program and grow and learn, and at the same time do, as Meredith laid out for us, not just build that capacity and show some leadership, but execute. And we're in that phase now. We're seeing in the AA, we're getting more to executing the core of the program on the street in the real world. And that's very exciting for us. And as you highlighted, looking forward towards the regulatory response, the potential for this program is huge to do really good things. And I just wanted, in the retrospective, I was thinking this morning about the GRSP itself. And when we first started the GRSP, before the regulations were actually adopted, it was a very different time. And it was a very different grasp. And it was a more charged environment of people's interests and concerns. While we shared a lot of similar goals, that it was a political process. It was a lot of questions about who was going to be on the hook for what. There was a lot of uncertainty and a lot of great minds and input and participation, and that got us to where we are, to get the regulations adopted. But in the years since, the GRSP has also grown and changed. And I just wanted to, I know Meredith feels the same way, and the staff too, is that I just wanted to thank you for your ongoing input and energy, because a lot of the input we get, not in this environment, is from folks that have very different interests sometimes, and everyone has to represent their interests, whether it's an advocacy group, industry, or academia. But this body brings together great minds with a unified purpose to help us. We really benefit from it. We really appreciate it. The thoughts that came out on the last day and a half, we're going to go back and chew on, and a lot of really amazing thoughts that are going to lead to us doing a better job. And so I just really want to say thank you. And I also just want to, I know it's sometimes hard when you come here twice a year and maybe see the fruits of your labors, but I just want to assure you that every time we get together, it just generates a lot of thought and discussion. And one of the benefits we have with our staff is that we have a great group of scientists and engineers who are not shy. They're very strong-willed. They're very smart. And we challenge each other, and we take all these seeds that you've given us and start putting water and energy and soil on top of them, and they grow. So thank you very much, and we'll look forward to this continuing to grow. And as we look towards the regulatory response and the implementation of the AAs on those issues come up, we count on you, and we appreciate it. And we'll also be looking forward to getting some more input as we add some members to the panel. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl. Art, do you have any closing words?
No, just that the panel members again warned me out. I have to listen so carefully to everything that you guys said. So it's not just sitting here, but just amazing job, you guys.
So, well, I want to close with a bunch of thanks, and I want to start with Kelly Grant. Dr. Kelly Grant was the leader in putting this together. She's hiding back there. She's not showing all the way she's kind of been over all of us, and I would like to actually thank her.
Could I just thank the folks who
helped me. So Ann Cooper was amazingly helpful of transitioning me. Chris Leonetti, Ching-Yu Meng, and Michelle Romero-Fishback have been hugely helpful in putting this all together.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank the staff both for all the amazing work you're doing, for your courage and bearing another part of your program to us. It's been several ones you've been going through. And the confidence, at least, that you've given me, and I think through the transparency, I hope the public as well, that you really are striving to build a pretty amazing high-capacity regulatory program. And I want to thank the staff for their service to the state, everybody in the room. It's service, and it really matters for California. As always, I'll echo the other thanks to the panelists and for your service and brainpower to help our state, and I think through our state, our country, and the world try to move forward and struggle with these issues in chemicals policy and a safer chemical future. I particularly want to thank Art, who's a quiet but amazing leader, who says all the right things, who finds time in between this crazy stuff he's doing internationally to drive safer products forward. And then finally thank the staff and the state for the privilege of being able to play this role in helping this program in our little way.
Thank you.
With that, this meeting is adjourned.